Chapter 1962. When Meg rushed to the northeast, he only saw a burning orc tribe. The raging flames had already engulfed the entire tribe. The thick smoke was mixed with the smell of blood that had yet to dissipate, making the flames even more demonic. His ability to sense the black fog was limited. If Irina was here now, she should be able to see some clues, but he didn't feel any special aura. System, where is that thing? Meg tried to ask the system for help. It has already disappeared. The host is late and cannot be tracked for now. The system's voice sounded in Meg's mind. Useless. Meg pursed his lips and squinted at the burning orc tribe. Suddenly, his eyes widened, and he waved his hand in a certain direction. The Tian-Du sword overturned a stone wall, and at the same time, forced the surrounding flames to disperse. Under that stone wall was the corpse of a male orc. From the wound on his neck, he could tell that he died from the standard longsword of the Roth Empire's knights. However, Meg wasn't concerned about that. Instead, he was concerned about his terrifying withered appearance. All the blood in his body seemed to have been sucked dry, leaving only a skeleton wrapped in skin. This wasn't caused by the flames, because the flames had yet to burn his body. This wasn't something that a knight's sword could cause. What's going on? Meg asked with a frown as he looked at the corpse. It has something to do with the black fog. The system's voice sounded. His target should be the blood essence and resentment of these corpses. So, this great old one had already expected that there would be such a war in the Twilight Forest, and after the war, he crazily absorbed the blood essence and resentment of the corpses to strengthen himself? Meg's frown deepened. Suddenly, a thought flashed across his mind, and he exclaimed, or this war was started by him, so the Northwest Border military received the order to slaughter the orc tribe. The only person who could do this is Josh. Irina had once said that she sensed the presence of the black fog on Josh, but she gave up because she couldn't find any concrete evidence. However, if all of this was planned and executed by Joshua, then it would make perfect sense. Andre and Sean had traveled thousands of kilometers to Chaos City to participate in the peace conference, but they risked being surrounded and attacked the orcs and elves at the same time. That was a very puzzling decision. When the news spread to the scene of the peace conference, Meg clearly saw a flash of astonishment on Andre's face. Now that he thought about it, perhaps even Andre didn't know that such a thing had happened. Andre wasn't stupid enough to anger the entire Norland continent. The Urba tribe's tragedy back then had a huge impact and was unforgettable. However, the Roth Empire's military had already created dozens of similar tragedies in the Twilight Forest. Although Sean had been operating in the Northwest for many years and had deep roots, it was impossible for him to bypass Andre and mobilize the entire Northwest Army to attack the Beastmen, let alone mobilize the Northeast Border Army to attack the Elves. As for how Josh, who had shallow roots in the military, managed to hide from Andre and mobilize two major military regions to launch an invasion, that probably had something to do with the Great Old Ones. What is this fellow trying to do? Meg's expression was a little cold as he clenched his fists and looked around. The sun had already set slowly from the west, and the surroundings were silent. Only the sound of wood burning in the flames could be heard from time to time. If Josh's motive is to absorb the aura of resentment, the host should stop more orcs from dying now. Only then can Josh be stopped, the system said. I suddenly regret that I only cut off one of his ears the last time, and didn't chop his head off directly. Meg kept the photo stone and jumped onto the griffin's back. He glanced at the corpse that was slowly being engulfed by the flames, and solemnly said, he won't have another chance next time. When can I appear in front of Alex openly and trample him on the ground? In a dark valley dozens of kilometers away, Josh walked out of the darkness with a hideous expression. The devil's whisper sounded in his ears. Big sister N, do you think father and mother have forgotten about us? We haven't even had lunch, and we can't even go through the door. Amy sat on the steps in front of Amy's with her chin in her hands. She turned to look at Anne, and her chubby little face was filled with sadness. Anne smiled and shook her head. She reached out to stroke Amy's head gently to comfort her. But I really want to eat roast goose. Amy looked at Ugly Duckling in her arms and swallowed her saliva. Ugly Duckling, who was lying down peacefully, suddenly widened its eyes and looked at Amy in horror. Then, it slowly moved towards and, trying to get away from Amy. General Iman looked at the empty castle in front of him, and couldn't help but chuckle. The elves are really so weak. They are so weak that I can't even feel that they used to be a race that was stronger than the Roth Empire. As the military commander of this invasion into the Wind Forest, he was a powerful 10th tier knight. He led 50,000 of the Empire's elite cavalrymen straight into the Wind Forest without encountering any large-scale resistance along the way. It was as if he had entered an uninhabited land, and he was able to directly enter the core region of the Wind Forest. This neighbor of the Roth Empire was shockingly weak in terms of combat power and defense. According to this progress, he would be able to lead 50,000 cavalrymen and claim the Wind Forest as the Roth Empire's territory in 3 days without any support from the Empire. Thinking that his name would be engraved in the history books of the Imperium for all eternity, Iman's ferocious face became even more twisted. After passing through this castle, we will march directly to the Tree of Life. Tonight, we will drink the water of life, hug the beautiful elves, and sleep under the Tree of Life. Iman announced loudly. His words instantly caused a round of cheers. The knights who were exhausted from the rapid march were suddenly energized, and continued to march with Iman. In the distance, the City of Life, which was built in the forest, could be vaguely seen. That was the symbol of the elves, and also the elves' last line of defense. Their unstoppable spirit gradually made these knights arrogant. They thought that as long as they reached the city, it would become the Roth Empire's territory, and the elves wouldn't even have the courage to resist. The City of Life didn't have tall walls, only a seal barrier. At this moment, the nobles in the city were as anxious as ants on a hot pan. Bad news came one after another from the front line. The Roth Empire's cavalrymen were getting closer and closer to the City of Life, but the elves were still unable to retaliate. It was really a headache. Chapter 1963. The elven guards guarding the goblins' border were returning from the south, but it was still unknown when they would reach the Wind Forest. The queen was in seclusion, and High Priestess Helena was still in Chaos City. Now, Sally was the only one in charge of the elves. Sioux elves didn't dare to trust her ability and judgment. There were even elves who snuck out of the city to seek refuge. Report. The Roth Empire's cavalry is still 15 kilometers away from the City of Life, and they are marching quickly. They are estimated to reach the City of Life in an hour. Report. The Vanguard Guards will reach the City of Life in 3 hours. The 2 pieces of bad news were sent to the discussion tent at the same time, and the gloomy elves looked even worse. See, I told you we can't stop them. The Roth Empire is too powerful. If we surrender and become a vassal state of the Roth Empire, we might still be able to maintain our dignity now, Elliot said with a trembling voice and a pale face. There were only about 5,000 elven guards in the City of Life. Because of the Night Elves incident, the relationship between the elves and the goblins worsened, and most of the troops were stationed at the southern line. With 50,000 Roth Empire's cavalry attacking, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that the City of Life was in imminent danger. A pessimistic mood spread in the tent. Someone, Elliot, is disrupting the morale of my troops. Take him away and lock him up. Sally suddenly ordered. Why, you want to arrest me? I am your father. Elliot glared at Sally angrily. The elves looked at each other, not knowing if they should take action. Those who disrupt the morale of my troops should be executed. The enemy is right in front of us, and I am already being merciful by not executing you. Sally looked at Elliot coldly and said in a cold voice, Didn't you hear my order? 2 elves immediately went forward and dragged the swearing Elliot out of the tent. Now, is there anyone else who wants to surrender? Sally's cold gaze swept across the elves. All the elves in the tent were stunned and lowered their heads. The little girl wasn't very powerful, but her aura already had a hint of a queen's demeanor. Master Denton, how long can the City of Life last? Sally asked Denton. The other elves also turned to look at the silent old elf sitting in the corner. Dan Dunn raised his head, his expression solemn. If we only have 5,000 guards, even if we have the advantage in numbers, I'm afraid we won't be able to hold on for more than 2 hours. Not even 2 hours? Sally frowned. The City of Life doesn't have high walls, and the ceiling barrier can only be maximized by the High Priest. The Roth Empire has 50,000 cavalrymen and many magic casters. If they focus their attacks on one point, they will be able to break through the barrier very quickly. 5,000 guards against 50,000 cavalrymen from the Roth Empire. They won't be able to hold out for long. Denton nodded. Why is the defense of the City of Life so weak? Sally was still confused. Princess, you may not know this, but the elves' defense policy has always been biased towards the outer layers, forming a spider web that blocks the enemy outside the City of Life. Therefore, every family has a sizable garrison. But this time, those families at the outer layers retreated without putting up a fight, which is equivalent to exposing the City of Life to the enemy's blade. In a hurry, it is very difficult to form a strong defense, Denton explained. These fellows? Sally clenched her fists. After 100 years of living like royalty, those elven lords had forgotten their mission. When a strong enemy came, they actually fled together, putting the City of Life in danger. I have already sent out a conscription order to the lords around the City of Life. If they come with their troops, it will be faster than the guards from the south, Denton added. Tell them that if they don't send reinforcements, or if they neglect us, they will lose their territories and status forever. We don't need such lords, Sally said coldly to Denton. All right. Denton nodded. He looked at Sally and hesitated for a moment before saying, There's one more thing. I would like to speak to you in private, Princess. Sally and Denton left the tent. Sally looked at Denton and said, Please speak. There are hundreds of thousands of elves in the City of Life. If we can get them to join us in defending the city, then we won't have to be afraid of the 50,000 Roth Empire cavalrymen. However, I am worried that the night elves will take the opportunity to create trouble, Denton said. The elves were all magic casters. Although there were strong and weak elves, it was not difficult to pick out a few tens of thousands of elves who had the ability to fight among the hundreds of thousands of elves living in the City of Life. Moreover, most of them were veterans who had experienced the racial war 100 years ago. Sally pondered for a while and said to Denton, The night elves are not evil. They are also our people. When the Wind Forest is facing an invasion and is about to be overturned, I believe they will not create trouble on purpose. They are more likely to become our allies to fight against the enemy. Denton looked at Sally with admiration and said, If that is your judgment, Princess, then please summon the elves in the City of Life immediately and let them join the battle to defend the City of Life. Once the city is breached, any unplanned resistance will be wiped out by the Roth Empire's cavalrymen. All right. I will go to the Tree of Life immediately to send out the summons. I will leave the matter of arranging the troops to you. Sally nodded and turned to walk towards the Tree of Life. She took a step, and a silver light flashed under her feet, and she disappeared on the spot. Soon, Sally's voice sounded in the City of Life. Residents of the City of Life, I am Sally. I believe you already know that the Roth Empire has started a war against the Wind Forest. They have invaded our land, killed our brethren, and are rapidly approaching the City of Life. We once regarded them as allies and reliable friends. But now they are stabbing us in the back, trying to put us to death. Now, the elves have reached a critical moment of life and death. 50,000 cavalrymen from the Roth Empire are sharpening their swords and rushing towards the City of Life, while we only have 5,000 guards in the city now. I need your help. The elves need your help. Just like how we chased the invaders out of the Wind Forest 100 years ago, this time, the elves also need you to stand up and stand with the City of Life to chase these bandits out of the Wind Forest. The elves went from panic to calmness. Someone took down a bough that was covered in ash from the wall, carried a quiver, hugged his wife and children, and walked onto the streets. Someone changed out of his luxurious clothes and put on a magician's robe, took out a magic wand, and walked onto the streets. Someone dug out an old armor from under the bed and squeezed his bloated body into it. The crowd gathered on the streets and surged towards the general appointment stage. The veterans donned their armor and defended the city again. Chapter 1964. The 50,000 cavalrymen marched straight in, and soon, the legendary City of Life appeared in the eyes of the Roth Empire's soldiers. However, the scene of them raising their flags and surrendering as they had expected didn't happen. Under the bowl-shaped barrier that enveloped the entire city, there were tens of thousands of elven soldiers standing in neat rows. However, apart from the 5,000 elven guards standing in the center, the elves on the sides and at the back were all in a mess of equipment. There were even some who were wearing casual clothes and carrying wands. However, the seemingly messy troop had a sense of cohesion that was hard to ignore. It actually made the Roth Empire's cavalrymen, who were all in neat and orderly formation, feel secretly shocked. Didn't they say that the City of Life only has 5,000 guards? Where did these fellows come from? Iman was also shocked to see the sudden appearance of 30,000 elves. The elves weren't a weak race. The Roth Empire had only caught them off guard. Iman had to take down the City of Life before the elven guards in the south returned to defend. Only then could he be considered to have achieved something in this war. What he was most worried about was actually Helena returning to the Wind Forest. Then, the elves would be in a state of disunity, and he might have to consider how to lead the Roth Empire's cavalrymen out of the Wind Forest. Along the way, he had seen elves fleeing upon hearing the news. He had thought that the elves in the City of Life would also be in a state of panic and wouldn't have the heart to defend it. However, the current situation also made him a little confused. This was obviously a troop that had been put together at the last minute. Many of them didn't even have proper armor. Even if they did, it was like an antique from 100 years ago and wouldn't fit them at all. However, it was such a hastily put-together troop, dressed in all kinds of clothes, that stood together in an orderly manner that gave off a chilling feeling. Iman gave the order to stop advancing, and the two armies faced each other 1,000 meters apart. A bunch of motley crew. General, give me 10,000 men, and I will definitely take down the City of Life. A deputy general stepped forward to request the order. After the other soldiers saw the elves' attire clearly, a contemptuous smile appeared on their faces. The Empire's cavalrymen, who were well-equipped, could easily crush this motley crew that had been put together at the last minute. General, let's attack the city. Our scouts have reported that there are still 2 hours before the 10,000 vanguard of the elves' southern garrison will arrive at the City of Life. We don't have much time left. Another general looked at Iman and said. Iman nodded and ordered, Couture will lead 10,000 heavy cavalry and elite mages to attack the city. The rest will enter the city and kill all the elves. Destroy the City of Life and burn the Tree of Life. Yes. Everyone responded in a low voice and began to deploy their troops. The main entrance of the City of Life had a straight road that was 100 meters wide, very suitable for cavalry charges. There were no high walls in the city, only tree walls that were about the height of a person. Heavy cavalry in heavy armor could easily destroy the so-called city walls. The faint golden light shield was faintly visible outside the city. It looked as thin as a bubble, as if it would burst at the slightest touch. On the other side, Barton, who was standing on the high platform, also deployed his troops and assumed a defensive posture. He looked at the veteran soldiers below with a smile on his old face. It was as if he had returned to the days when the smoke of war was everywhere. It was also this group of people who risked their lives to drive the invaders out of the Wind Forest. Soon, Couture led 10,000 heavy cavalry and charged towards the City of Life under the cover of dozens of mages. At the forefront of the troop were 10 heavily armored bloodthirsty rhinos. As level 5 magic beasts, bloodthirsty rhinos were violent and bloodthirsty. They also had a terrifying charging force. An adult bloodthirsty rhino could easily knock down thick city walls. Their thick skin and heavy armor made them troublesome meat on the battlefield. They were always successful in attacking cities. Iman directly released these 10 sharp weapons in order to allow Couture to quickly tear a hole in the City of Life's defensive line and take down the city. The 3-meter-tall and 10-meter-long terrifying beasts ran, causing the ground to shake violently. The ear-piercing roars of the beasts hurt people's eardrums. The 10,000 heavy cavalry followed closely behind the bloodthirsty rhinos. They were like a black flood of steel, surging towards the City of Life. Release the arrows. At the command of the commanding officer, thousands of arrows wrapped in various colors flew out, turning into a rain of arrows that covered the heavy cavalry. The elves were the children of nature. They had a natural affinity with magic. Moreover, their survival in nature had forged their exquisite archery skills. With the addition of magic, the arrows had greater penetrating power and lethality. At this moment, the sound of magic chanting came from behind the heavy cavalry. A level 10 mage and dozens of other mages conjured a huge protective shield that covered the sky above the heavy cavalry. Skyfall. Almost at the same time, a level 10 mage standing at the back of the elves shouted coldly. The sky changed color. Huge red meteors fell from the sky, falling towards the heavy cavalry. The sound of magic chanting came from the elves' side. All the elements in the sky were thrown into chaos. Fireballs, icicles, windstorms, earth spikes, all kinds of magic covered the sky and covered the earth as they fell towards the charging heavy cavalry. Be careful. The magic casters from the Wrath Empire looked at the magic spells coming towards them, and their expressions changed drastically. A huge meteor with a red tail smashed down with a loud rumble. The extremely wide barrier was like a bubble that had been popped. Boom! The meteors landed on the ground with a loud bang. Flames and rocks shot out in all directions, engulfing the heavy cavalry within a radius of tens of meters. The charging formation was broken instantly. The meteors broke the seal, and the magic enchanted arrow rain poured down without any hindrance. The sharp arrows crashed into the heavy cavalry in heavy armor. Other than the thick metal plates on their breastplates, the arrows penetrated almost everywhere else. It was just a round of arrows, and hundreds of heavy cavalry fell off their horses. After the arrow rain, it was a magic storm that filled the sky. Vines and mud walls suddenly burst out from the ground, and tripped a large number of heavy cavalry. Thousands of different levels of magic spells rained down at the same time. The heavy cavalry in heavy armor had strong physical resistance, but they couldn't withstand the baptism of magic. Meanwhile, those 10 bloodthirsty rhinoceroses suddenly missed a step when they were 100 meters away from the magic barrier and fell into a huge gully that suddenly appeared in the ground. Soil and rocks quickly filled up the gully. The ground only shook for a while before it became silent. Retreat! Retreat quickly! Emmanuel looked at the heavy cavalry that was engulfed by the magic storm. The horn for retreat sounded, but only the 10 odd magic casters at the back retreated. None of the heavy cavalry could turn their horses around in time. Chapter 1965. The magic storm gradually subsided, and the soldiers of the Wrath Empire had never seen thousands of magic casters casting spells at the same time. The younger generation of the elves had never seen it before either. Hence, when they saw the mess on the ground, their faces were filled with shock and fear. 10,000 elite heavy cavalrymen were almost wiped out in this magic storm. Several 10th-tier magic casters, dozens of 8th-tier and 9th-tier magic casters, a group of 7th-tier great magic casters, and countless mid-tier magic casters had cast the most powerful spells they had learned in their lives on this piece of land. However, the so-called motley crew had smiles on their faces now. My youth is back. A bald uncle rubbed his head and laughed mischievously. The surrounding elves also laughed. Yes, the younger elves might not have seen such a scene before, but they had worked together to force the invading demons and orcs out of the Wind Forest. 100 years had passed, and some of them had become nobles in the City of Life, some had become peddlers, and some had become servants of the nobles. No one would have thought that they would be able to stand side by side here today to defend against the invasion of the foreign enemies again. Looking at the clansmen who had once fought side by side with him, their clothes and identities were worlds apart. But in the past, they had all exchanged their lives for this land, this home, for this 100 years of peace. But in the end, they had walked into completely different lives. 100 years had passed, and they were still the ones standing here. This was ridiculous. Many of the elves' eyes flashed with sadness and shame. They too were all wiped out? Sally's eyes widened as she looked at the 10,000 heavy cavalrymen who had almost been wiped out in disbelief. These were the most elite heavy cavalrymen in the Wrath Empire. She had only hoped that these people who had hurriedly gathered could help the City of Life hold out for these 2 hours until the elven guards arrived. So powerful! In the City of Life, the younger elves were also in disbelief when they saw this scene. This is nothing. The orcs and demons were much more difficult to deal with back then, but they were still chased out of the wind forest by us. One of the elves who could no longer walk grinned. Don't underestimate this motley crew. They are the real veterans who have been through hundreds of battles. Those little bastards in the guards can't compare to them. Then why did some of them become servants? A young elf asked in confusion. That's the saddest thing. A trace of mockery flashed through the old elf's eyes. The group of people who shed their blood for this forest and this race, the group of people who fought to defend their freedom, lost their freedom in the end, and their freedom was taken away by their own people. But when the crisis came, they still stood up without hesitation. The surrounding elves were silent and fell into deep thought. On the high platform, Barton had tears in his eyes. In the past, he had also stood in this position and commanded the elves to repel the attacks of the orcs and demons. 100 years had passed, and his opponent had become the Wrath Empire. He was still standing here, and his warriors were still the same. Damn it! Bastard! Iman looked at the heavy cavalry lying on the ground, and his eyes turned red. This was his most precious troop, the elite of the elite. The cost of nurturing a heavy cavalry was almost 3 times that of a normal cavalry. This was equivalent to destroying half of his foundation. What was even more detestable was that they died so miserably and didn't even cause any harm or threat to the City of Life. If he had known that the other party had such a large number of powerful magic casters, he wouldn't have been so careless as to send the heavy cavalry to attack first. General, what should we do now? The deputy general who had suggested attacking immediately said with a trembling voice. They had been stationed at the border for many years, and were quite familiar with the elven lords at the border. They only felt that the elves were seriously corrupted internally, and that most of them were cowards. And they didn't meet any resistance on their way to the City of Life, which seemed to confirm this point. Never in his wildest dreams would he have thought that he would fall in the hands of such a motley crew. However, he was also glad. If he had been greedy and fought with Couture for the first credit of attacking the city, he would have been dead by now. Attack the city. Continue to attack the city. I want to see how strong this motley crew is, and if they can really stop the Wrath Empire's heavy cavalry. Iman gritted his teeth and raised his hand to summon a few generals, and gave them instructions. A long whistle sounded, and a troop of 1,000 steel-backed eagles suddenly appeared in the sky. They split into 2 groups, and began to fly around the City of Life. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. Arrows flew from below, but because the steel-backed eagles were flying very high, only a few of them fell. The 40,000 heavy cavalry split into 4 groups, and surrounded the City of Life. As a veteran general, Iman knew very well that this wasn't a good strategy to attack the city. When the heavy cavalry was wiped out, and the enemy's reinforcements were about to arrive, he should be thinking about how to lead the army to retreat, and meet up with the reinforcements at the back, before discussing the next battle plan. However, the military order he received was to take down the City of Life at all costs, and do his best to inflict heavy damage to the elves. He didn't know what the higher-ups' goal was, but he knew very well that this order meant that his troops would have to sacrifice everything for the Empire's interests, including the lives of the soldiers. The magic storm created by thousands of magic casters gathered together was too terrifying. There was no chance of survival within the range of the magic storm, and it couldn't be compensated with human lives. Therefore, he dispersed his troops, and at the same time, forced the enemy to disperse their troops and eliminate the magic storm. Do these fellows really not want to live anymore? They don't even have reinforcements. Barton looked at the enemy troops who had changed their formation with a puzzled expression. However, in the previous attack and defense battle, they had been unprepared and caught the enemy off guard. That was why they were able to wipe out the enemy's heavy cavalry regiment. Now that the enemy had changed their formation, he could only adapt accordingly. However, they only needed to hold on for another hour now. The surrounding lords were rushing over with their troops, and the guards would reach the City of Life in another hour. After receiving the signal of the arrival of the various troops, Iman slowly pulled out the long sword at his waist and shouted, "Take off your shields. Charge towards the City of Life." This time, Iman led the charge. He rode the liger beast forward, and with a leap he covered more than 10 meters. His speed was so fast that even the best archers of the elves couldn't predict his position. Behind him, the 10,000 heavy cavalry charged towards the City of Life again. 5 groups of troops attacked the City of Life from 5 different directions at the same time. Battle cries shook the sky. At this moment, the Tree of Life in the center of the City of Life suddenly shone brightly. Chapter 1966. Magic and swords clashed, and in the absence of a magic storm, the knights weren't completely defenseless. In the end, the knights still arrived before the magic barrier and began to attack it in a frenzy. The Ironback Eagles were also attacking the barrier from the sky and converging toward the Tree of Life at the center of the City of Life. Their target was clearly the Tree of Life, the holy tree that symbolized the soul of the elves. Destroying it would destroy the confidence of the elves. The unmanned protective barrier was on the verge of collapse. The elves in the City of Life looked on with concern at the barrier that seemed to be on the verge of shattering at any moment. More and more people walked onto the streets to join in the defense of the city. If we can't even protect the Tree of Life, the elven race will cease to exist. Snare stood on a roof and looked up at the Ironback Eagles that were attacking the Tree of Life in a frenzy. He leaped down from the roof and flew toward the Tree of Life. At the same time, Sally also turned around and rushed toward the Tree of Life. If the barrier was broken, Barton could command the elves to continue to defend the city, but if the Tree of Life was destroyed, she would become a sinner of the elven race. Pop! A light pop sounded like a bubble being popped. The protective barrier around the City of Life was broken, and the sky was cleared. Both sides were stunned for a moment, and then they entered into a desperate close combat phase. The Ironback Eagles in the sky were also no longer obstructed, and they ignored the arrows that were flying toward them from the ground as they flew toward the Tree of Life without any hesitation. Their mission was to destroy the Tree of Life, and whoever completed this feat would be made a marquis upon their return. The Tree of Life was several hundred meters tall, and its slender branches glowed with a faint green light. It was mysterious and holy, and its branches swayed gently as if they were alive. "Destroy it!" The commander of the Ironback Eagles yelled as he led the charge toward the Tree of Life. "No!" All of the elves cried out in alarm, and countless arrows shot toward the Ironback Eagles from different directions. The number of Ironback Eagles gathered above the Tree of Life was reduced by more than half in an instant. However, there were still several dozen Ironback Eagles that managed to break through and quickly descended toward the Tree of Life. Pessimism and despair rose in the hearts of the elves. Was the Tree of Life, which had not been destroyed in the racial war, going to be destroyed here? This was the holy tree that communicated with the goddess of life, the source of the water of life, and the spiritual symbol of the elves. The knights raised the swords in their hands, and the iron-backed eagles spread their sharp wings. If they destroyed this tree, they would leave their names in history. "Little tree, beat them up." At this moment, a cold voice suddenly sounded. The Tree of Life, which was originally only flickering with a faint green light, suddenly shone brightly. The gently swaying branches suddenly rose up like whips, drawing out blurry cracks in the void, and then fell on the body of the swooping ironback eagle. Pa-pa-pa! A crisp sound resounded through the sky as the gigantic ironback eagle was sent flying by the weak willow branch, crashing into the ground with a loud bang. Like swatting flies, the hundreds of ironback eagles that were dancing wildly in the sky were all sent to the ground in an instant. Together with the knights, they were all dizzy and lost consciousness. A golden light flashed, and a figure in a white dress appeared above the Tree of Life. Her silver hair danced in the wind, and her exquisite and beautiful face had a cold expression. "It's Princess Irina! Princess Irina is back!" The elves, who had yet to recover from the shock of the Tree of Life's sudden attack, saw Irina suddenly appear and immediately erupted into cheers. The protective barrier had been broken, and the City of Life had fallen into a full-scale battle. The Roth Empire's knights displayed their incomparable strength in close combat, and forced the elven allied army to retreat continuously and were about to be utterly defeated. And at this critical moment, Irina appeared in the City of Life and immediately became the savior in the hearts of all the elves. Sally stopped in her tracks and looked at Irina, who had appeared above the Tree of Life, with elation on her face. The Tree of Life was fine, and the elves finally had someone they could rely on. "Your Highness." Snare also stopped in his tracks and looked at Irina with elation in his eyes. She had indeed come. What is she doing here? However, there were also some elves who looked at Irina with bewilderment. If Irina had summoned the night elves to attack them at this critical moment, it would be one disaster after another. Why is Irina here? Iman was also shocked. He had thought that Helena would come back, but he didn't expect Irina to be the first to arrive. At the same time, he looked around to see if Alex had also come. Irina hovered in the air as she scanned the City of Life, which was engulfed in the flames of war. She was astonished at the sight of the elves who had volunteered to defend the city, and her eyes flashed with fury. She raised her magic caster staff, and holy light lit up the entire City of Life. The elven warriors and the knights of the Roth Empire were forcefully separated by the holy light. The branches of the Tree of Life swayed, and a faint green light gathered above her head, providing her with even more powerful enhancement effects. "Get out of the wind forest immediately!" Irina yelled coldly at Iman. Iman looked at Irina with furrowed brows. "General, the vanguard of the guards has arrived. We have to retreat." "There are still 2 elven troops of unknown origins in other directions," a deputy general whispered into his ear. At the same time, 3 flying steeds were quickly flying toward them from the distance. They didn't hide their auras at all, and their identities were revealed. Iman's determination to fight to the death was completely destroyed, and he ordered, "Send the signal, retreat." A red signal flare rose into the sky, and the knights who were attacking the City of Life from 4 different directions hurriedly turned their steeds around and retreated. "We won!" The elves' cheers instantly rang out in the air above the City of Life, and their faces were brimming with joy. They hugged one another to celebrate this victory, even though their identities were different. This bunch of bastards. Helena's flying steed finally arrived in the air above the City of Life, and her face was ashen as she looked at the devastated city. "The ones who saved the City of Life weren't those lords that you designated, but these ordinary elves." Irina looked at Helena and said with a hint of mockery, "Back then, you all made that laughable policy and threw away the most precious thing to the elves. You may have forgotten, but they didn't, so they stood up again." Helena looked at those ordinary elves who were covered in blood. Elves of different identities and clothes were mixed together, but they seemed so harmonious at this moment. Their smiles were so simple, just like back then. Chapter 1967. The Roth Empire retreated hastily, and the guards arrived. Irina and Helena arrived one after another. Reinforcements from the surrounding lords had also arrived. This inexplicable attack had come to an end. However, the effects it brought would not disappear because of this. Some memories could not be erased easily once they were awakened. "You're right. We chased the orcs and demons out of the wind forest 100 years ago like this. 100 years later, we're still using the same method." Helena looked at the elves who were supporting each other with a complicated expression. Then she looked up at Irina. "We're not wrong, and they're not wrong either. However, those lords are indeed terrible. I will replace them all. No matter who sits in that position, the result will be the same." Irina sneered. Then she looked at the elves below. "Besides, when everyone realizes that what you did was wrong, do you think you can continue to maintain this state?" The elves below looked up at Irina and Helena, and then quickly lowered their heads with different expressions. "Your ambition to divide the elves will not succeed." Helena looked at Irina and coldly said, "Now, you should leave this place. If you don't have the ability to protect this forest and these elves, I will come again. At that time, you will see what a real elf should be like." Irina reached out to touch the branch of the Tree of Life. Golden light flashed under her feet, and she disappeared without a trace. The branch of the tree of life swayed slightly, as if it was bidding farewell to Irina. I won't be wrong. This is the only way out for the elves. Helena slowly clenched her fists. Barton looked up at Helena and asked, High Priestess, should we pursue the Roth Empire's cavalry and reclaim our lost land? Please give us your instructions. Barton, I order you to lead the army in pursuit. Chase all the other races out of the country and reclaim our elven territory. Helena had already regained her tough style and ordered. Barton accepted the order and left. Summon all the lords for a meeting. I have something to discuss with them, Helena said to the elves beside her. After a pause, she said, Ask Sally to come and find me. Little boss, why aren't you going in? It's so cold outside. Harrison asked curiously as he held Georgina's hand and looked at Amy and Anne, who were sitting on the steps. We don't have the key. Father isn't home. We're waiting for him to come home. Amy looked at the two of them holding hands and smiled at Harrison. Uncle Blue Fatty, is this beautiful lady your daughter? Georgina covered her mouth and chuckled. Not only was this little girl beautiful, but her mouth was also super sweet. She actually said that she was so young. Do I look that old? Harrison was not at all annoyed by Georgina's happy smile, just a little troubled. That's not it. It's just that you're as old as a few older sisters, so you look like a father. Amy shook her head. Yes, I feel very safe. Georgina blushed and nodded. She leaned her head against Harrison's chest and smiled. During this period of time, Harrison brought Georgina everywhere to look for food every day. Her face gradually became rosy, and her original skinny state improved a lot. There was more meat on her face, and she regained the aura of a young girl. Hee. Harrison smiled honestly. He could not help but want to give Amy a thumbs up for her help. Just then, Cece walked out of the magic potion shop next door and called out to the two, little Amy, and come and eat. Amy's eyes lit up. She stood up, and her stomach started growling. After saying goodbye to Harrison, she held Anne's hand and went to the magic potion shop. Mr. Mac is really too much. The two children are at home. Why didn't he tell me? I would have cooked earlier. Cece made a few dishes and put 2 bowls of rice in front of Amy and Anne. She looked at the 2 little fellows with pity. Father must have been delayed by something. Maybe he went to catch a goose. He said he was going to make roast goose for us, Amy explained with a smile as she took a bite of rice. You silly child. Cece couldn't help but laugh. She was actually just saying that casually. She didn't need to doubt Boss Mag's sincerity toward the 2 children. If he hadn't been held up by something, he definitely wouldn't have let the 2 children go hungry. Amy tilted her head and looked at Cece's slightly protruding belly and asked curiously, Big Sister Cece, when will the baby in your belly be born? And also looked at Cece curiously. She was also very interested in the baby in Cece's belly. It's still early. It's still a very, very small baby now. It will only be born in a few months, Cece said with a smile. Her smile was glowing with motherly love. Amy went forward and touched Cece's belly gently and said, Baby, you have to be good. When you are born, you can play with your big sisters. And also touched Cece's belly gently with a smile. Meg stopped the 4 Roth Empire's troops that were invading the Twilight Forest one after another. Under the pressure of the Allied forces, they were forced to retreat from the Twilight Forest. The troop that was attacking the August tribe happened to meet Oster, who had just returned to the tribe. Both sides were not easy to deal with. After a fierce battle, they chose to retreat when the other orc tribes came to reinforce them. Another troop went to the Fok tribe and was surrounded by the allied orc forces of over a dozen tribes. All 30,000 of their cavalrymen were killed or captured. However, the retreating Northwestern Alliance army did not retreat to the original border. Instead, they moved the original border 100 kilometers in the direction of the Twilight Forest and set up camp there. The backup supply lines had already been opened and followed up. Where is Joshua hiding? Meg rode the griffin and circled above the massacred tribes in the Twilight Forest, but he could not find any traces of Josh. The system also did not give any feedback. How to deal with the aftermath was the orcs and the Roth Empire's problem. What he was more concerned about now was that Josh might have already sold his soul to the Great Old One. Was this Great Old One who controlled Josh related to the missing Great Old One under Dragon Island? After instigating the war between the three races, did Josh really become stronger after absorbing the resentment and blood essence of these dead orcs? He's a ruthless person. Meg still chose to give up in the end, and gave Josh an evaluation. To be able to give up the throne and his identity as the Empire's second prince, and become the devil's puppet without hesitation, what else would such a person not do? It's over. I forgot about Amy and Anne's dinner. Meg raised his hand to look at his watch instinctively. Suddenly, he slapped his head, and anxiously said, Z, let's go back. Chapter 1968. When Meg returned to Chaos City, the sky was already dark. He told Az to go back to her nest at the textile factory. After changing his clothes, Meg pushed his bicycle out of the alley and bumped into an auntie who was carrying 2 pots. "Mr. Meg," the auntie exclaimed in surprise when she saw Meg. Meg stared at Rebecca, who was wearing the uniform of a hot pot employee. He was a little surprised and asked, "Madam Rebecca, what are you doing here?" "The child hasn't had much of an appetite for the past 2 days, so I went to East 2nd Street to buy her 2 pots of Auntie Tao's chili sauce. This chili sauce is very fragrant and delicious. It can be mixed with rice and noodles. Also, they recently got 2 round animals to put at the door to attract customers. I heard they're called penguins," Rebecca said with a smile as she waved the 2 pots of chili sauce in her hands. "I see. That's pretty good." Meg looked at the huge pots of chili sauce in her hands. He didn't expect there to be people in Chaos City who specialized in making chili sauce. "Please, take 1 pot back. Amy will definitely like this. The last time she came to my house, she ate 3 bowls of rice with this chili sauce." Rebecca put one of the pots of chili sauce into Meg's bicycle basket. She smiled at Meg and said, "Jessica said she wants to go and play with Amy in a few days' time. I've been busy with work these past few days, so I didn't have time to bring her over." 3 bowls of chili sauce wasn't enough for other people, but 3 bowls of chili sauce wasn't enough for Amy. Hence, Meg felt that Rebecca was telling the truth. Excluding the fact that Amy was very hungry at that time, this chili sauce should be pretty good. Meg also hadn't eaten pure chili sauce for a long time. He didn't want to reject Rebecca's kindness, so he smiled and said, "All right, thank you. You can bring Jessica over when you go to work tomorrow. Amy hasn't been going to school for the past few days, so the children can play together." "All right. Take care. I have to go back and cook for the children." Rebecca nodded with a smile. Meg got on the bicycle, said goodbye to Rebecca, and rode away. When Meg returned to the restaurant, the 2 little fellows were playing with jump boxes at the entrance of the restaurant. Ugly Duckling was squatting at the side, looking at them eagerly. Cece was knitting at the entrance of the magic potion shop. There was a heater by her feet and she looked up at the 2 children from time to time. When she saw Mr. Mac coming back on his bike, she put down the sweater in her hands and said, "Mr. Mac, you're finally back. The 2 children have been waiting for you the whole day. I went out to look for ingredients today and walked a little far, so I came back late." Meg was a little embarrassed. Cece glanced at the clay pot and a fat duck in Meg's bicycle basket and said, "The children have had lunch, but they insisted on waiting for you to come back for dinner. Hurry up and make them something to eat." "Thank you. I have to trouble you to cook for the 2 children," Meg said gratefully. "Father, you're back." Amy had also discovered Meg. She immediately ran over and jumped into Meg's arms. "Are you hungry?" Meg hugged Amy and looked at her with a doting smile. I'm hungry." Amy nodded honestly, and her stomach began to grumble as well. She looked at the fat goose in the bicycle basket, and her eyes lit up immediately. "Can we eat roast goose tonight?" "Yes, Father will make roast goose for you tonight." Meg nodded with a smile. He looked at Anne, who was also smiling, and reached out to pat her head. "Our Anne must be hungry too. Let's go home. I'll cook for you," and nodded. Her eyes narrowed into crescents as she smiled. Meg opened the door and went in. He had already decided to give Amy and 2 sets of keys later. This way, Even if he wasn't home, the two children could go home by themselves and wouldn't have to wait pitifully outside. System, you're not very smart at all, Meg criticized in his mind. The system has no obligation to take care of the host's children, nor do I have the authority to open the door, the system retorted. Amy followed behind Meg with her little hands behind her back. She scrutinized Meg like a little adult. Father, why did you and Mother go out the whole day? Did you go on a secret date and forget about us? And also looked at Meg. Meg was a little embarrassed. Today's matter was urgent, and he had indeed forgotten to go home and cook. That's right. I've been looking for him all day. I was just wondering who he went on a secret date with. Just then, a teasing voice sounded. Irina appeared in the dining room and looked at Meg with a smile. Is that really the case? Amy looked at Meg and then at Irina. Meg spread his hands. This is really unfair. Unfair? Amy blinked and pointed at the big fat goose that stuck its head out of the basket. Is that it? No, it's a penguin. Meg smiled. Looking at Irina's expression, the wind forest shouldn't be a big problem. He parked the bicycle. Wait here for a while. I'll go wash up and change my clothes. Then I'll come down and cook for you. I'm going to wash up too. Irina walked towards the stairs. Together? Meg asked without thinking. There's a private bathroom in my room. Irina looked at Meg and gave him a mysterious smile. Then she went upstairs. What's the meaning of that smile? Meg raised his eyebrows and followed her upstairs. Meg took a shower and quickly changed into a chef's suit before coming downstairs. When he carried the big fat goose, Meg took out the bottle of chili sauce and said to Amy, Aunt Rebecca asked me to bring you this chili sauce. She said you like it, and Jessica will come to play with you tomorrow. I love this chili sauce. It's super delicious. Amy went up and hugged the big jar of chili sauce. She said happily, This is great. I haven't played with Jessica in a long time. Meg carried the fat goose into the kitchen. It was a baby goose that was a cross between a black-haired goose and a wild goose. It was only 3 months old, but it was very plump and tender. It was a high-quality goose specially bred by the system to make roast goose. Roast goose was different from roast duck. This difference was reflected in the handling of the ingredients, cooking methods, and eating methods. Bleeding the goose, plucking its feathers, cutting off its feet and the tips of its wings, removing its innards from its tail, and blowing to separate its skin and flesh. Meg had already developed muscle memory for these steps in the test field for the god of cookery. To make a top-notch roast goose, it was an out-and-out technical work. After putting the roast goose covered in a layer of syrup into the oven, Meg breathed a sigh of relief. It was his first time making roast goose in a real kitchen. He was still a little nervous about whether he could produce a perfect roast goose. While waiting for the roast goose to be cooked, Meg made a few more dishes. When the oven beeped, Meg had already prepared a table full of dishes. He opened the oven and took out the roast goose, which was golden red in color. A rich aroma wafted out. Gulp. The 3 people standing at the kitchen door swallowed at almost the same time. Chapter 1969. The freshly cooked roast goose was golden with a hint of red in the middle. The color was exceptionally bright, and a strong aroma wafted through the air. Meg held the roast goose with one hand and nodded with satisfaction. The color and appearance were perfect, and the aroma was authentic. It was the best roast goose. This color, I love it, Irina exclaimed. It looks better than the roast goose from the roast goose shop on the street. Amy nodded her head and stared at the roast goose in Meg's hand. Meg smiled as he removed the needle from the roast goose and poured the gravy from the roast goose into a small bowl. This was the essence of the roast goose. The strong aroma of the spices came from it, and it still had important uses. Compared to the finely sliced roast duck, the roast goose was much simpler. He took the fathead fish, put the roast goose on a clean chopping board, and chopped it into even pieces. Then he directly put it on a plate. At this time, he poured the gravy evenly on the cut roast goose and let the gravy soak into the meat. Then he could serve it. Of course, the sour plum sauce was indispensable to eat the roast goose. The sour plum sauce was provided by the system. Meg made 4 of them, carried the roast goose out of the kitchen, and said, "All the dishes are ready. Let's eat." "My chopsticks are ready." Amy sat on the chair and stared at the roast goose in Meg's hand. "You can eat it directly, or you can dip it in the sour plum sauce. You can choose the taste," Meg said with a smile as he put the roast goose in the middle of the table. "Okay." Amy nodded and reached out with her chopsticks to pick up a duck leg and put it in Meg's bowl. "Father, you worked hard. This duck leg is your reward." "Rewarding me with the roast goose leg I made? Is this okay?" Meg looked at the duck leg in the bowl, but the smile on his face had already exposed his inner feelings. "So good. My baby daughter knows how to care for him." Thinking of this, he glanced at Irina proudly. "Mother, thank you for your hard work. This big duck leg is for you." Amy then picked up a duck leg that was even bigger than the one Meg gave to Irina. Meg's smile froze. "Thank you, Xiaomi." Irina looked at Meg with a smile. She picked up the duck leg, dipped it in the sour plum sauce, and put it into her mouth to take a bite. Ugh, the sweet and sour taste of the sour plum sauce instantly activated his taste buds, which had been running around for the whole day and had barely eaten anything. The crispy and fragrant goose skin, the tender and plump goose meat, and the thick fragrance of the goose meat all blossomed in this mouthful. The goose meat absorbed the gravy and became tender and juicy. With a slight chew, the skin and flesh separated. The more one chewed, the more fragrant the meat became. When dipped in the sour plum sauce, it had a unique flavor. Irina seemed to see a big fat goose spreading its wings and about to take flight. She saw the vast sky, and she saw, after a long time, Irina opened her eyes and took a deep breath. She looked at Meg and said seriously, "You can't escape from me in this lifetime. Even if you have my woman, your heart is also hers," Amy added on for him. "That's right." Meg nodded. The corners of his mouth curled up with a hint of smugness. Sure enough, conquering a woman starts with conquering her stomach. Amy also picked up a duck leg for N. Then she picked up the last duck leg, dipped it in the sour plum sauce, and took a bite. Her blue eyes lit up instantly. Her little mouth moved quickly, and she quickly swallowed the goose meat in her mouth. Before she could say anything, she took another big bite of the goose meat. Her cheeks were puffed up, and she chewed very happily. Her face was full of bliss, and she looked very appetizing. He couldn't help but want to swallow his saliva. Meg felt that Amy must have clicked on new boasting talent. She could always make people hungry. So roast goose is really super delicious. I love roast goose. Amy finally found the time to say this after she finished half of the goose leg. She didn't forget to turn to look at Ugly Duckling. "Ugly Duckling, you have to eat more too. Grow up quickly." Ugly Duckling, who was focused on eating a piece of goose meat, stopped. The goose meat in its mouth suddenly didn't taste good, and was eating the roast goose leg in small bites. Judging from her excited expression, she should like this roast goose very much too. Meg wasn't in a hurry to eat the goose leg. Instead, he picked up a piece of breast meat and put it into his mouth directly without dipping it in the sour plum sauce. The breast meat had skin, meat, and bones. An excellent roast goose had to have many excellent qualities. The skin was crispy and fragrant, and the crispy water made with malt sugar gave it a hint of sweetness when chewed. The skin, meat, and bones seemed to be tightly connected, but they separated easily once it entered the mouth. The gravy had already seeped into the bones. Chewing together with the skin and bones, the more he chewed, the more fragrant it became. The taste of the plump and tender goose meat was just right. It was fat but not greasy. Yes, this is a perfect roast goose. Meg swallowed the goose meat in his mouth and nodded with satisfaction. As a senior foodie, roast goose was a famous dish with a very high status in Cantonese cuisine. He had tasted many famous dishes and also complained about many of them. However, there had never been a roast goose made by a famous chef that gave him such a delicious experience. "It's too good. I'm almost mesmerized by myself." Meg sighed. This was really embarrassing. However, since he had achieved this step, he was worthy of the roast goose recipe that gathered all the master's lifelong knowledge. Dinner ended happily. The two children brought Ugly Duckling upstairs to play while Meg started to clear the table. How's the situation over at the orc side? Irina asked Meg as she helped to clear the chopsticks. The Roth Empire created dozens of tragedies in the Urba tribe among the orcs. Many tribes were directly massacred. Even the children were not spared. Meg's expression was a little grave. Andre, that old bastard. Isn't he afraid of angering the masses? Irina said angrily and confusedly with a raised brow. It's possible that it wasn't Andre's order. Meg shook his head. I found the existence of a strange black fog in one of the massacred tribes, and I also saw this. Meg took out a photo stone and showed Irina the corpse of the orc whose blood essence had been sucked dry. This is? I suspect that Josh, who sold his soul to the devil, started a war against the orcs and elves behind Andre's back, and gave the order to massacre the orc tribes. Meanwhile, he relied on absorbing the resentment and blood essence of these dead orcs to increase his power. You sensed the existence of the black fog on his body previously. He should have already come into contact with the Great Old One at that time, Meg said. If that's the case, we have to find him as soon as possible and kill him. Irina's expression also became serious. Could he be in Rodu now? Chapter 1970. Meg wasn't sure if Josh would be in Rodu, but he knew that Andre should be having a headache right now. The crimes committed by the Roth Empire's army in the Twilight Forest would definitely cause a huge uproar among the various races. It would force the Peace Alliance, which wasn't firm enough to stand on the same side. The orcs and elves, who were rather powerful, lost more than half of their territories in just one day. Dozens of their tribes were even massacred. If the Roth Empire's big stick landed on the dwarves or goblins, it would definitely be a disaster that would wipe out their entire race. The members of the Peace Alliance had to work even more closely because of the Roth Empire's threat. They would treat the Roth Empire as their #1 enemy. Although the Roth Empire was powerful, Andre's original plan was to form an alliance with the forest trolls, rope in the elves, and maintain a certain level of harmony with the giant dragons before expanding. If Josh was in Rodu now, the first person to deal with him would be Andre. Rodu Royal Study. Bastard. Andre threw the urgent military report in his hand and sternly said, "Surround the military headquarters. Arrest everyone involved and interrogate them in the prison. Get Dominic to come back and see me immediately." The officer received the order and left quickly. All the officials in the royal study lowered their heads and didn't dare to say anything. The Empire's army had been mobilized without His Majesty's orders. Furthermore, they were mobilizing troops against the orcs and elves at the same time. This was a huge matter. The army losing control was something that His Majesty couldn't tolerate. This meant that there could be a mutiny at any time, and the Empire could collapse. The officials present also couldn't understand. Who was it that made so many people risk their lives just to wage war against the orcs and elves? Andre walked out of the royal study and asked his attendant, "Have you found Josh?" "Your Majesty, we haven't found the second prince. Everything in the second prince's residence is normal. No one knows where he is," the attendant quickly replied. "What about the Magus Tower?" Andre frowned. The Magus Tower said that the second prince went to the Magus Tower this morning, but he only went to the library once and left very quickly. However, according to our investigation, the second prince did go to the military headquarters this morning. We are still investigating the people he came into contact with. Find him. I need him to explain some things to me face to face, Andre said with a cold expression. In the Twilight Forest, in front of a slaughtered tribe, the delegation of the Peace Alliance stood silently. "I think we should be prepared for a new race war," Lewis said in a low voice. "Andre is challenging our bottom line. If we tolerate his actions, it means that our peace alliance is just a joke," the dwarf representative said angrily. "That's right. We have to make the Roth Empire pay the price for what they have done. Even their ally, the elves, was almost wiped out. They have lost their minds." The goblin representative nodded in agreement. All the representatives were filled with righteous indignation. Apart from being shocked by the Roth Empire's actions of slaughtering the tribes, they all expressed their condemnation. After 100 years of peace, The phrase, massacring a city, had not appeared on the Norland continent for a long time. And on the first day of the peace conference, the Roth Empire created dozens of massacres in the Twilight Forest. They almost wiped out the entire east side of the Twilight Forest. Their methods were extremely cruel. Roland, the representative of Chaos City, came to the scene and interrupted everyone's discussion. There's still a devil wandering around the human world. According to the scene depicted in the murals, the devil will become stronger through killing. This is something even scarier than this war. The scene fell silent and everyone's expression became a little grim. What we have to do is to stop the war, and not change the way to fight a more tragic war. This is not what the Norland continent needs now, and it might cause another bigger problem, Roland continued. Yes. The most important thing for us now is to find that devil that escaped from the seal, and stop the Roth Empire from launching another war. Lewis nodded. He looked at everyone and said, the giant dragons will send an official notice to the Roth Empire, warning them not to launch another war against the Peace Alliance, and asking them to punish the culprits who participated in the massacre. I hope that every member nation can act together to show the Roth Empire our attitude. After coaxing the two little fellows to sleep, Meg went to the city lord's castle that very night. He passed the photo stone to Michael and told him his judgment. If that's the case, I'm afraid it will be very troublesome. I think Andre will never admit to this. Just the photo stone of a corpse is not very convincing. Michael frowned. After all, Irina didn't find anything wrong with Josh when she used the holy lights. It's not important whether Andre admits to it or not. As long as we can confirm that Josh is related to the devil, we might be able to find that devil that escaped from the seal from him. That's enough. Meg's expression was slightly cold. Michael nodded thoughtfully. I will get all the spies to look for Josh's whereabouts. Meg nodded. He chatted with Michael for a while more before taking his leave. The peace conference was forced to stop, and the war restarted. The Norland continent was in a terrible turmoil, and many people were destined to have a sleepless night. However, Chaos City was still as peaceful as ever. People had not realized what might happen, and continued with their original habits. Meg went back to the restaurant, washed up, and went to bed to have a good sleep. The next morning, Meg opened his eyes as soon as the alarm went off. He reached out to turn off the alarm and got out of bed. After standing the customers up for 2 days, Amy's should be open for business today. We'll be launching a new dish at noon today, roast goose. Mag wrote a delicacy notice on the little blackboard and hung it at the restaurant's entrance to appease the customers' negative reviews and grievances. We're in luck. Seems like we're in for a treat this morning. Mr. Mac is finally opening the restaurant. Harrison saw the line at Amy's entrance from afar, and excitedly said to Georgina, who was still sleepy. Oh. Georgina blinked. Soy milk and youtiao. It's the perfect combination for breakfast. Add a bowl of tofu pudding, and this breakfast will be complete, Harrison said with a smile. I like tofu pudding. Georgina's eyes lit up, and her sleepiness disappeared instantly. She pulled Harrison and jogged to Amy's. Tofu pudding was a limited product, and they would not be able to eat it if they were late. Roast goose? It's rare that Mr. Mac would come up with such a simple name. I wonder how he'll cook it. Of course, he'll cook it in a delicious way. Mr. Mac skipped 2 days of work to create a new dish. There's no need to doubt it at all. He'll be done with it. The customers lining up at the entrance were already discussing. Chapter 1971. Meg stood behind the window and smiled as he watched the customers discussing the roast goose enthusiastically. The best way to appease the complaints of foodies was indeed to give them a new delicacy. Even if it was just a preview, it could make them look forward to it the whole morning. Father, when will Jessica come? Amy asked expectantly as she came downstairs in a pretty dress. Her mother will bring her over when she goes to work. Meg just has to wait at home, Meg said with a smile. All right. Amy nodded. She picked up Ugly Duckling, which was lying at her feet, and asked, Then, when can we eat roast goose again? Ugly Duckling, who was originally sleepy, opened its eyes immediately and looked at Meg and Amy warily as if it was worried that it would become an ingredient. If Amy likes it, we can eat roast goose again at noon, Meg said with a smile. He turned his gaze and looked at Ugly Duckling with a smile. However, we haven't settled on our goose for today. Meow, meow, meow. Ugly Duckling stuck its head out and called out to Meg anxiously as if it was announcing its identity. Yes, the story says that when spring comes, Ugly Duckling grows wings, flies into the sky, and becomes a white swan. Amy nodded. She looked at Ugly Duckling with a serious expression and said, Ugly Duckling, spring is coming and you can fly too. A duck that has been reared for 1,000 days will be stewed in a pot. Just accept your fate. Meow meow? Ugly Duckling stared at the father and daughter. I may not be a real duck, but you are a real dog. Meg stopped teasing Ugly Duckling and looked at Amy as he asked, All right, what do you want to eat for breakfast? Father will make it for you. I want to eat youtiao. I want to dip it in chili sauce. That chili sauce is delicious, Amy said without hesitation. There's such a way of eating? Meg raised his eyebrows. He had no doubt about Amy's gourmet talent, but the way she ate fried dough sticks with chili sauce really surprised him. He just didn't know how this chili sauce would compare with lao gan ma. Yes, you can dip it in anything. It's delicious. Amy nodded her little head, fully expressing her love for this spicy sauce. Shortly after the morning service, Rebecca brought Jessica to the restaurant. Rebecca rushed to work at Manna Hot Pot restaurant after talking to the child. Meg knew that she had waited until the restaurant was closed before sending the child to work. She did not want to cause trouble for him. The children went upstairs to play. Meg made himself a pot of black tea and sat down by the French window. He didn't think too much about the great old ones and the war for now. He could only rely on Chaos City and the various races of the Peace Alliance for information. He checked his faith points and found that it had increased to around 25,000. This was already a rather exaggerated number. One had to know that this was completely based on the replay of the Delicacy Conference to attract fans. He still needed 25,000 faith points to reach the next level. If there were no accidents, he wouldn't be able to complete it by relying on this year's Delicacy Conference. However, the report on Whole Food Mart had yet to be published, and his column had yet to be published. Meg was still looking forward to the spread and influence of words. Since he had nothing to do in the morning, Meg even specially wrote the first draft of his column, Eggplant with Garlic Sauce Recipe Made Public for the First Time. Eggplant with garlic sauce was Mamie's most famous dish at the moment. Although his main goal was to promote the octopus tentacles, eggplant with garlic sauce was obviously the best choice in terms of expanding his influence. Writing a draft was a very mentally taxing thing. It took him almost an entire morning to write a short draft, and a few pages were scrapped. Mother, have you found Gaga? No, I've searched everywhere, but I couldn't find Gaga. Don't worry, Zikala. Let's search slowly. We'll definitely find it, a middle-aged lady comforted a young girl with red eyes, looking a little guilty. I can't find it anywhere. Gaga must have been caught and eaten by someone. It's so pitiful. It's just a child. Gaga is so pitiful. Zikala burst into tears on the spot. She looked so pitiful, which attracted the attention of passers-by. Don't cry, don't cry. It's all my fault. I shouldn't have let it walk at the door. I didn't expect someone to take it away. Jean Funi wiped her tears with a look of self-blame and said, Let's go and look for it again. Maybe it just flew away. Let's ask more. Maybe someone will see it. Maybe it will come back by itself in a short while. Really? Zikala stopped crying slowly and asked while sobbing, Of course it's true. I know Gaga is very important to you. I will accompany you to find it. Jean Funi nodded and sighed silently in her heart. Gaga was a pet goose raised by Zikala. Zikala hatched it from an egg. She treated it like an ancestor, and it was rarer than anything else. It was inconvenient for Zikala to take Gaga with her when she went out today, so she asked Jean Funi to look after Gaga for her. Jean Funi ran a big breakfast shop in the Aden Square. When she was busy, she forgot about Gaga. She just asked the waiter to let Gaga walk at the door. When she was done, she remembered it and went out to check, but Gaga was gone. It seemed that it was taken away by a woman. When Zicala came back and heard the news, she broke down immediately. She dragged her to look for Gaga everywhere. "Hello, have you seen a goose? It's white and fat with a yellow mouth. It sounds like Gaga. It's about this big and it can fly." Zicala stopped a passerby and asked. The passerby thought for a while, and then pointed at the vegetable market not far away, and said, "As you just described, there are as many as you want in the vegetable markets? Thank you. My Gaga is not an ordinary goose. She is unique. They are all geese." Zicala was a little disappointed, but she didn't lose her manners. "Have you seen?" Jean Funi also started to ask the passerby. However, the more they asked, the more disappointed they were. No one would notice a goose, and they couldn't provide any useful information. "A goose? Maybe you can go to Mamie's to have a look." A passerby who was in a hurry was stopped, and said casually, "Mamie's?" The two's eyes lit up. This was the first news they heard that directly pointed to a certain place. When they were about to ask for more details, the passerby had hurried away. "Mother, do you think Gaga is really in Mamie's? If it's in the restaurant, would it have been eaten?" Zicala looked at Jean Funi expectantly and worriedly. "Don't worry. At least we got some useful information. Let's go to Mamie's first. If Gaga is really there, I can exchange 10 roast geese for it. I won't let it get hurt." Jean Funi held Zicala's hand and comforted her. "Okay." Zicala nodded. Following the address Jean Funi asked from the passerby, they walked to Mamie's, which was on the east side of Aden Square. When they arrived at the entrance, they only saw 3 children playing by the door. Chapter 1972. There were 3 little girls, one of whom was 11 or 12 years old, and the other 2 were only 4 years old. They were all very cute. Zicala tried to calm herself down, and went up to them. "Excuse me, cute little girls, have you seen my Gaga again?" "Gaga?" Amy stopped dancing and looked back at Zicala. "What's that?" "Gaga is a goose, but it's not an ordinary goose. It's my baby. It's round and chubby, and has a yellow beak. It's about this big and round. It's super cute. It can fly a little bit." Zicala tried to describe. "I know," Amy said thoughtfully. "Really?" Zicala's eyes lit up immediately. She looked at Amy in surprise. "Where is it?" Jean Funi, who didn't have much hope, also had her eyes lit up. She looked at Amy nervously. She knew how important Gaga was to Zicala. If Gaga really disappeared because of her, she would be sad for a long time. Amy turned around and lifted up Ugly Duckling, who was napping on the steps. "Look, is this the one?" Ugly Duckling was confused. "Huh?" Zicala and Jean Funi were both confused. Although this orange cat looked round and chubby with a yellow beak and was super cute, it was still a cat. She was clearly looking for a goose. Don't be fooled by its appearance. It's actually an ugly duckling, and it can fly a little bit. When spring comes, it will become a white swan and fly freely in the sky. Of course, it may not be able to fly because it's too fat, but it's okay. We can still make it into roast goose, Amy explained. Meow meow? Ugly Duckling opened its eyes wide. Did you hear that? Huh? Zicala and Jean Funi also opened their eyes. Although they didn't understand the first part of Amy's words, they heard her say she wanted to make the goose into roast goose. Oh my God! Gaga is so cute. How can you eat it? Tears were already welling up in Zicala's eyes. Today's new dish is roast goose. Goose is my favorite. It tastes better than duck. Yeah, but I don't know what kind of cooking method Mr. Mac used. The roast goose at the entrance of the square is pretty good. We have to peel off the goose's skin first. Otherwise, we won't be able to get rid of the feathers on it. The customers arrived one after another. When they saw the small blackboard hanging on the door of the restaurant, many customers who saw it for the first time began to discuss it. Kaka, you died so miserably. Zicala couldn't bear the grievance and burst into tears. This pitiful wail startled all the guests and they all looked at her in astonishment. They are not talking about Gaga. Don't cry. Zhenfuni smiled apologetically at the crowd and held Zakala's hand. But they eat goose. This restaurant roasts goose. It's so miserable. Zakala still wanted to cry. Right now, Zhenfuni only wanted to give a loving kiss to the guy who had led them to a restaurant that was not friendly to geese at all, which made her have some bad associations. Then let's go to other places to look. Maybe Gaga ran to other places. It shouldn't have run so far. Zhenfuni wanted to take Zakala away from this miserable place. She was afraid that Zakala would feel even worse when she saw the roast goose. No, I think Gaga is in here. I have to save it. Zakala wiped away her tears and looked at Mamis with glowing eyes, and said firmly. But Zhenfuni looked at the exquisite restaurant in front of her. As the proprietress of the breakfast restaurant in Aiden Square, she was no stranger to this Mamis. As the current leader of the catering industry in Chaos City, Mamis was known as the miracle of the industry. If someone said that their boss stole their goose, she would not believe it herself. If there is no business, there is no killing. I have to meet the owner of this restaurant and ask him to let Gaga out. Then I will ask him to give up on killing geese, Zakala said firmly. Zakala, as a goose lover, your mother understands your feelings. But we need to discuss this matter first. Although Gaga is very cute and very important to you, we can't stop others from eating the goose because of this. Zhenfuni pulled Zakala and lowered her voice a little. But, Gaga, if there is someone who loves America one day, are you going to starve yourself to death? Amy, who had been listening to the whole conversation, looked at Zakara and interrupted. Zakala choked and didn't know what to say. Besides, the roast goose is super delicious. You can also try it. After eating our roast goose, you can forget about Gaga who flew away. Amy didn't forget to promote her new product. I don't want to eat. Zakala quickly shook her head. Then let's go. Zhenfuni held Zakala's hand. No. I have to see if Gaga is inside. Zakala shook her head firmly. She looked at Mamie's signboard, took a deep breath, and seriously said, I want to line up and wait for him to open the door. All right, it's about time for lunch anyway. Let's have lunch here and try the culinary skills of the best restaurant in Chaos City. Zhenfuni didn't try to persuade her anymore. At least it was better than her running around like a headless fly. Ugly duckling, you are so ugly. No one wants you. Amy stroked Ugly Duckling's head and sighed softly. Meow meow. I want you. Ugly Duckling is so cute. I love you. Jessica opened her arms and hugged Ugly Duckling. She rubbed her face against its furry head. Meow, Ugly Duckling rubbed its head against Jessica's chin proudly to prove that it was still wanted. It can't be helped. Jessica is just too kind. Amy sighed. Zakala stood in the front row and listened to the gluttons talking about the 1,000 ways to cook the roast goose. Tears slid down from the corners of her mouth. They are so cruel. Zakala wiped the tears from the corners of her mouth, and her stomach began to growl. They made us two women who haven't had breakfast bear the temptation that we shouldn't have. Zhenfuni nodded in agreement. Zakala turned to look at Zhenfuni. Zhenfuni also realized that she seemed to have said something she shouldn't have. She looked a little embarrassed. She suddenly pointed to the front and said, "The door is open." Zakala turned around, and the door of the restaurant was indeed opening slowly. A handsome young man in a clean chef's suit walked out with a charming smile. Welcome to Mamie's. No pop-up window. Chapter 1973. Looking at Meg, Zakala was surprised that the owner of this restaurant was a young and handsome man. He looked about 30 years old, but his temperament, figure, and skin were all very good. He looked more like a successful elite. If he wasn't wearing a chef's uniform, she wouldn't associate him with a greasy chef. Zhenfuni was also sizing up Meg. As an old cook who had been working in the breakfast industry for 30 years, she had heard a lot of praises from customers about Mamie's breakfast recently. She had long been interested in this restaurant owner, whose reputation had spread far and wide in less than half a year. She had heard that the owner was single and had a child by himself, so she had considered whether she was suitable for him. After all, she was widowed and had to raise a child by herself. But now, after seeing Meg, she began to consider whether Zicala was suitable for him. She squinted at Zicala and saw her slightly infatuated expression. She couldn't help but smile helplessly. Gaga was not that important. "Father, that young lady said she was looking for a goose." Amy went forward and pointed at Zicala. "Please come in. Roast goose is a new product launched today. If you like to eat goose, I think Miss will like it." Meg looked at Zicala with a smile and said. The girl was about 20 years old. She was wearing a long cotton dress and her long black hair was tied behind her back. She looked young and fresh, but her eyes were red as if she had just cried. "I'm looking for a goose, not a roast goose. And I like goose, not eating goose." Zicala was roaring in her heart. But when she saw the cute Amy and the gentle smile on Meg's face, she swallowed her words back. She said thank you meekly and ran into the restaurant with a red face. "I'm not here to eat roast goose. I'm here to find Gaga." "Yes, that's it," Zicala told herself in her heart. She found a seat near the kitchen and called her mother over. "This restaurant is really good. The owner has put a lot of thought into it. No wonder so many people like it. The environment alone is incomparable." Jean Funi couldn't help praising as soon as she sat down. As an old caterer, she had her own pride. But after entering Mamie's, this pride was so fragile that it turned into dust. Her breakfast shop was particular about affordability and cleanliness, so that customers could eat at ease and at a reasonable price. As soon as he entered the restaurant, he was struck by a sense of exquisiteness and comfort. Furthermore, the furnishings and decorations were not out of place at all. It was definitely one of a kind among the restaurants in the Eden Square. Because they were not on the same level at all, Jean Funi easily accepted the psychological hint that there was no need for comparison. Her mentality turned into that of a customer and she began to praise this restaurant. "Mother, you've changed." Zicala looked at Jean Funi and said, "You are not the kind of person who praises other people's restaurants." She had heard Jean Funi complain about all the restaurants they had tasted together. Jean Funi's fancy nitpicking skills were unrivaled to this day. "I'm just an ordinary customer today," Jean Funi said calmly. Zicala curled her lips, indicating that she didn't believe him, but she didn't ask further. "We're not here to eat. We're here to find and rescue Gaga." Zicala lowered her voice and looked at Jean Funi with a serious expression. She pointed in the direction of the kitchen and said, "Gaga might be here now, waiting for our rescue. If we don't take action, it might become a roast goose." Jean Funi stared at Zicala's face for a while. After hesitating for a while, she said, "Why don't we take a look at the menu first to understand the situation?" "All right." Zicala nodded reluctantly. "The color of this red braised pork looks really good. This steamed fish head with diced hot red peppers looks really spicy. Mother, it's not suitable for you. I've heard of tofu pudding before. One of my sisters said that after eating it, her skin became 10 years better. One of my sisters has also been recommending me to try this. I have a few pimples on my face recently. I don't know if it's effective. Look, it's so easy to forget being a goose. It can't even be compared to a bowl of tofu pudding." Amy sat behind the counter with Ugly Duckling in her arms and began to lecture it. "But they really seem to be looking for a goose," Jessica said worriedly. "If my goose went missing, I'd be worried too," Amy said. Ugly Duckling turned to look at Amy, and its eyes lit up. As expected, Mistress still loved it. It's such a rare thing. If Father roasted it, it would become a delicious roast goose. Anyone would be worried if they lost it, Amy said seriously. "Omega Omega?" Ugly Duckling's eyes widened immediately. "Listen, is that even human language?" Zicala and Jean Funi studied the menu with great interest. It was such an exquisite menu, and the pictures of each dish were thoughtfully placed on the menu, so that people wouldn't be confused by the weird names of the dishes. Moreover, each dish looked so delicious that it was hard for people to choose between them. "It's roast goose. It looks good too." Jean Funi found the roast goose below the roast duck. She was a little speechless when she saw the price of 2,000 copper coins. "It's just a little expensive. My poor Gaga." Zikala looked at the tempting red roast goose and couldn't help but swallow her saliva while blaming herself for forgetting Gaga and being so engrossed in the menu. Why don't we order one and try it? Jean Funi asked Zikala. No, that's too much. Zikala shook her head. Know yourself and know your enemy, and you'll never be defeated. We have to know how he cooks it first so that we can find a way to deal with Gaga, Jean Funi continued. Is that necessary? Zikala frowned with uncertainty. Of course. We'll just watch him cook it. If it's Gaga, we'll spend money to buy it back. This is also our chance. But Zikala was still a little hesitant. Mia came to their table and asked with a smile, "What would you like to order, dear customers?" 1 braised pork with soy sauce, 1 sweet tofu pudding, and 1 eggplant with garlic sauce. Jean Funi ordered the dishes she wanted to eat. She glanced at Zikala and said tentatively, "And 1 roast goose." Zikala's expression changed, but she chose to endure it at last. Then she ordered 1 savory tofu pudding and 1 stir-fried octopus tentacles. This is all for saving Gaga, Zikala told herself in her heart. Okay, please wait a moment. Mia nodded with a smile. Zikala stared at the kitchen. The young boss seemed to be making preparations, boiling soup, or cooking something in advance that needed to be pretreated. After a while, the girl in charge of ordering dishes came in and reported the order to him. Zikala clenched her fists nervously. She hoped it wasn't Gaga, but also hoped it was Gaga. Then, the boss took out a featherless goose from the freezer at the side. Chapter 1974. Zikala was dumbfounded. How can it be a processed goose? They only have 1 chef, but they have as many customers as a big restaurant. If the ingredients are not processed in advance, it will be too late, Jean Funi explained. But, how do I know if it's Gaga? Zikala was a little anxious. Jean Funi thought for a while and said, "Then we can only try it." Zikala opened her eyes wide. I mean, look at the goose in the boss's hand. It doesn't look like Gaga, Jean Funi quickly explained. It doesn't look like it. Gaga is not that big. Zikala stared at it for a while and nodded. Then she pursed her lips and said, "But where would Gaga go? Why can't we find it anywhere?" Jean Funi patted the back of her hand and comforted her. "Don't worry. After dinner, I'll ask those girls to help you look for it. They have a lot of connections. Maybe they can find it." Zikala nodded and calmed down a little. Soon, the dishes they ordered were served one after another. The bright red braised pork was fragrant, and the stir-fried squid was delicious. But what attracted their attention the most was the white and tender tofu pudding. Women had no resistance to anything that could make them beautiful. Of course, before coming to Amy's, they still had some doubts about the rumor that tofu pudding could beautify them. After all, those who claimed that eating could make them beautify quickly were mostly liars. But no matter whether it had beautifying effects or not, the tofu pudding in front of them looked very tempting. The fresh bean fragrance hit their noses. The sweet one looks great. Jean Funi turned the bowl around and looked at the syrup evenly spread over the tofu pudding. The consistency and color were just right. The salty one looks better. It won't be greasy. Zikala pushed her own salty tofu pudding. And you can't eat too much sugar. Just eat a little every now and then. It's okay. Jean Funi couldn't wait to scoop up the tofu pudding. The tofu pudding was like egg custard, but it was more springy than egg custard. Jean Funi dug into the tofu pudding that was covered by the golden red syrup. The cut was as white as jade, but it was quickly covered by the sticky syrup. The tofu pudding that was wrapped in the crystal clear syrup swayed slightly in the spoon, looking like an exquisite piece of art. The fragrant and tender tofu pudding almost melted in his mouth, and the syrup that was wrapped around it was extremely rich. The sweetness of the syrup blended perfectly with the tofu pudding, and a faint tofu pudding lingered in his mouth. It was sweet but not greasy. Jean Funi opened her eyes and couldn't help but praise the tofu pudding in front of her. This flavor is definitely the best dessert ever. As a person who had been dealing with breakfast pastries for decades, he still couldn't imagine how the boss had turned soybeans into such a delicate and delicious delicacy. Hearing that, Zikala couldn't help but scoop up a spoonful of tofu pudding. The white tofu pudding was wrapped in the orange-red syrup, and there was a little bit of chopped pickled mustard on top. The tofu pudding looked very springy, and when it was put into his mouth, it melted without chewing. The sweet tofu pudding, the savory pickled mustard, and the syrup blended together perfectly, and her eyes lit up immediately. It's really delicious. Zikala felt that she was suddenly wrapped in warmth, and her mood after losing Gaga was also eased. For the time being, she just wanted to immerse herself in the enjoyment of the delicious food and feel this blissful and wonderful feeling. Soon, the mother and daughter both ate a serving of tofu pudding. Although I don't feel any changes, I really want another bowl, Zikala said after putting down the spoon, still longing for more. Then let's have another serving. Zhenfuni nodded in agreement and asked Mia, who happened to pass by, for another serving. I'm sorry, dear customer. The tofu pudding is limited every day, and each person can only order one serving, Mia said with a smile. I said, okay, thank you. Zhenfuni nodded. As a caterer, she naturally wouldn't make things difficult for the waiters. What a pity. Then we can only come back next time. Zikala was a little disappointed. Come on, we've had the appetizers. Now let's try the other dishes. Zhenfuni picked up the chopsticks and put a piece of red braised pork into her mouth. This red braised pork is also delicious. Try it. Zhenfuni ate the fat but not greasy red braised pork and also put a piece into Zikala's bowl. This meat is so fat. Zikala looked at the red braised pork with a little resistance, but when she saw Zhenfuni's stunned expression, she hesitated for a while and then picked up the red braised pork and took a small bite of the lean part of the meat. With a gentle bite, the sweet and fragrant gravy flowed out of the meat. Even the lean meat was crisp and chewy, and it melted in her mouth with a gentle chew. This meat? How can it be so delicious? Zikala opened her mouth slightly and revealed an expression of disbelief. Even the lean meat that was usually dry became so delicious. You will lose your soul if you eat like this. You have to eat the whole piece of meat with the skin to experience the real ultimate delicacy. Zhenfuni had already picked up the second piece of meat and didn't forget to remind her. I can't eat too much fat meat, Zikala said, but she still put the whole piece of red braised pork into her mouth. The soft wild boar meat almost melted in her mouth. The lean meat was crisp and chewy, dry but not greasy, and the skin was smooth and tender, and the bite was barely discernible. With a gentle bite, the fragrant and sweet gravy flowed out of the meat. It was fat but not greasy, and the delicacy of the red braised pork was perfectly released at this moment. As a child who grew up in restaurants, Zikala completely inherited Zhenfuni's taste. She was very picky about food. But at this moment, she couldn't find any fault with this piece of red braised pork. Even she, who hated fat meat, was addicted to the ultimate experience brought by the fat meat and the skin, and couldn't extricate herself. This boss is so awesome. Zikala raised her head and looked at Meg in the kitchen, and couldn't help but exclaim. Yeah. If I could find such a son-in-law, I wouldn't have given birth to a daughter in vain. Zhenfuni nodded her head. Mother, Zikala said with a blush on her face. I just said it casually. This young man is pretty good. Zhenfuni looked at Meg with a motherly smile, as if she had already decided on a son-in-law. I don't want to talk to you. Zikala lowered her head and ate 2 mouthfuls of rice, and then picked up a piece of red braised pork and put it into her mouth. Here's your roast goose. Please enjoy. At this time, a voice suddenly sounded in their ears. Then, a large plate of paper floated out of the kitchen and landed gently between them. A roast goose that had been cut open and pieced back together was lying on the plate quietly, with 2 dipping sauces beside it. Chapter 1975. The rich aroma of the roast goose wafted over, suppressing the aroma of the other dishes on the table. The surrounding customers all looked over. This was the first table of customers who had roast goose, and they all wanted to see their comments and reactions. Quack! Zikala, who was eating happily, looked at the roast goose in front of her, and tears started to well up in her eyes again. The color, the aroma, the plate presentation, and the knife skills. This boss is really young and promising. Zhen Funi continued to praise. She picked up a piece of roast goose breast with her chopsticks, dipped it in the dipping sauce, and put it into her mouth. Oh my god! Oh my god! This roast goose is amazing! Zhen Funi's eyes lit up, and she exclaimed. As she spoke, she picked up a small goose leg and put it in the dipping sauce in front of Zhen Funi. Quack, it's so miserable. Why is a goose so pitiful? Zikala couldn't help but take a bite of the roast goose leg with tears in her eyes. The goose skin was crispy and fragrant, and the meat under the skin was especially tender and plump. The rich aroma of the braised goose seemed to have permeated every part of the meat. As she bit down, the gravy burst in her mouth, and her taste buds were shocked. The dipping sauce was sweet and sour, and stimulated her taste buds. She only chewed a little, and the skin and meat separated. The more she chewed, the more fragrant it became. There was also a faint aroma of roasted fruits. Zikala was shocked on the spot. This taste completely overturned all her imagination of roast goose. It's so fragrant. Zikala couldn't help but think of Quack as she ate. Then, she couldn't help but think of Quack. Tears came from her heart, and she couldn't help but cry. Look, she's crying so sweetly. Amy looked at Zikala and whispered, "Isn't her goose gone? Why does she still want to eat it?" Jessica was puzzled. Amy put her head on Ugly Duckling's head, and said without hesitation, "It means she's sad because her fattened goose flew away, and she didn't even have a bite." "I see." Jessica and nodded thoughtfully. Zikala felt sorry for Quack in her heart, but her body was too honest. In the blink of an eye, she swallowed a roast goose leg, and even the bones were all eaten. "Look, didn't I tell you that it would definitely be delicious?" That lady was so delicious that she cried. She truly understood what it meant to be extremely delicious. An uncle next door looked at his wife sitting opposite him and said carefully, "Madam, why don't we try one too? If we don't eat it, we'll definitely regret it." "Are you staring at the little girl?" The madam's eyes were filled with killing intent. No, I'm just looking at the roast goose." The man's body trembled and he quickly shook his head. His status in the family was obvious. "All right, then I'll order one." The lady took a deep look at the man and nodded slightly. "Madam is wise." The man was overjoyed and quickly called the waiter to order a roast goose for himself. The crying Zikala indeed brought a very good advertising effect to the roast goose. The customers who were used to letting others test the thunder first began to place orders for the new roast goose. Looking at the roast geese floating out of the kitchen, Zikala chewed the roast geese with tears in his eyes and faced life with a smile. Burp, Zikala and Zhen Funi let out a long burp at the same time. The two of them looked at each other, and then at the empty plates in front of them. They were stunned for a moment, and then they revealed a polite and awkward smile. "Are you full? Let's go and look for Gaga," Zhen Funi said. "All right." Zikala nodded. She felt a little guilty at the mention of Gaga, and then she couldn't help but think of that delicious roast goose. "Let's go." Zhen Funi stood up to pay the bill. Before she left, she didn't forget to take a look at the kitchen and praised softly, "This young man is really good." "Let's go." Zikala held Zhen Funi's arm and left quickly. Zhen Funi looked as if she was a mother-in-law looking at her son-in-law. After they walked out of the restaurant, Zhen Funi couldn't help but look back and say with a smile, "The food was really good. We can come here often in the future. I didn't expect there to be such a delicious restaurant in Chaos City." Zikala agreed unenthusiastically. She calmed down a lot after they walked out of the restaurant, but she was still worried about Gaga. "Let's go. I'll bring you to meet those aunties of yours. They might have a way to help you find Gaga." Zhen Funi held Zikala's hand and prepared to leave. Puff puff. Just then 2 sounds of flapping wings sounded. A big white goose wearing a silver collar flapped its wings and landed in front of them. The two of them stopped in their tracks and were stunned. "Gaga." Zikala looked at the collar on the big white goose's neck and said with surprise and joy, "Don't run, fat goose. I'm going to kill you and cook you today." A middle-aged woman with short hair rushed towards them with a knife in her hand. She looked fierce and ferocious. That big white goose looked back and was about to take off again in a panic. Don't be afraid. I'm here. Zicala quickly squatted down and hugged it. She glared at that middle-aged woman. The passers-by said a fat woman with short hair took away their Gaga. It must be her. That woman rushed to Zicala, who was hugging the goose, and said fiercely, You let go of me. This is my goose. Nonsense. This is my goose. Zicala said angrily. She reached out to touch the goose's head and comforted it. Gaga, don't be afraid. I'm here. You're talking nonsense. My goose just ran out and you said it was yours. Let everyone be the judge. How can you do that? If you don't let go of me, I'll beat you. That fat woman said and was about to pull Zicala away. At this moment, many people had gathered around them to watch the fun. Sister, don't you think it's too much to talk to a child like this? Jean Funi stepped forward and stood in front of Zicala. Who are you? The fat woman stopped and looked at Jean Funi, who was dressed luxuriously. She suddenly became less aggressive. I'm his mother, Jean Funi said. You can't do that even if you are his mother. This goose is mine. You can't take it for yourselves. The fat woman became arrogant again. Oh, you really dare to say that? Jean Funi sneered. This goose was hatched from an egg and raised by my daughter. She treats it like a treasure. This morning, I let it out for a walk in front of the shop, and you took it with you. We searched for it all morning, but we couldn't find it. Then we ran into it on the road. You said it was your goose, but I think you are the thief who stole it. Hearing this, the fat woman changed her expression and said unnaturally, You're slandering me. How can you prove that this goose is yours? Gaga's collar was custom-made when it was 1 year old. It's in the Stallone's silverware shop in front of us. Do you want me to take you to the boss to verify it? Zicala stood up with Gaga in her arms and said to the fat woman, You're crazy. I don't want this goose. I'll give it to you as a gift. The fat woman cursed and turned to leave quickly. Zicala snorted at her back and hugged Gaga tightly in her arms. Chapter 1976. Maybe Gaga hadn't realized the change in her position in her master's heart. She snuggled in Zicala's arms and called out to the fat woman proudly. Jean Funi went up and touched Gaga. She wanted to say something to comfort her, but she changed her mind. Gaga is really fat. Zicala and Jean Funi looked at each other and smiled. There was something strange in their smiles. Gaga, Gaga, Gaga. Gaga rubbed her head against Zicala's hand and called out. Okay, I know you're hungry. I'll take you home to eat now. Zicala carried Gaga home and scolded her in a low voice. Also, don't run around in the future. Don't wander around alone. If you meet bad guys, you should know to run home. You're a good girl, but we can't be together. But I don't deserve you. Slept. The girl cried like a weeping beauty. She retracted her trembling hand. That's not what you said when you chased me yesterday. You know, people change, and I'm a fickle person. The young man with long red hair looked up at the sky at a 45-degree angle and sighed. Actually, I knew from the beginning that we couldn't make it to the end. Ooh, you bastard, I don't want to hold you up. You deserve better. The young man looked at the girl and said calmly, Go home early. I won't see you off. Boo-hoo, the girl cried and turned to leave. Sighed. Sentimental people always have a lot of troubles. The young man looked at the girl's back and sighed softly. Aren't you the scumbag that the girls always talk about? A white-haired old man who was leaning against a pillar with a slender bamboo stick in his hand said with a smile. I'm not a scumbag. I just want to give each of my sisters a home. The young man looked melancholy. That's enough. I came to Chaos City on official business. You've only been here for a few days, and you've already ruined so many girls. The old man rolled his eyes. However, upon closer inspection, his eyes were actually completely white. Grandpa, you're going too far. I'm just having a heart-to-heart talk with these beautiful girls. I didn't even touch their hands. How can you say that I'm defiling them? I have professional ethics. Noah said seriously, since I can't stay for them, I can't leave too many traces in their hearts and bodies. That's immoral. You're quite the scumbag, aren't you? Morant laughed. Suddenly, he started coughing violently. It took him a while to calm down. Hee hee. Noah patted Melander's back, seemingly unfazed by his coughing. He smiled and asked, "But Grandpa, we've been here for 3 days, and we haven't seen the thing you're talking about. Could it be that you've miscalculated and that thing hasn't been born yet?" Melander shook his head slightly and said that half of it in the Thunderstorm Mountains is pretty good, but the other half has escaped. We've been to many places in the past 2 years, but we're always late. The tortoise-shell stone predicted that that thing might appear in Chaos City, so it's not wrong to come here and take a look. All right, then let's walk around and take a look. Noah nodded. He picked up the bag on the ground and carried it on his back. He followed Melander unhurriedly. Melander was holding a thin bamboo pole in his hand, but he didn't touch the ground like a normal blind person. He walked like a normal person and even knew how to avoid obstacles and people. He didn't look like a blind person. However, if you looked closely at him, you'd notice that his ears were moving slightly. Noah followed beside Melander, but he was still a little restless. He looked around, and when he saw young and beautiful girls, he would stop for a while. However, he only looked at them and didn't do anything out of line. The grandfather and grandson turned into the Eden Square. Melander suddenly stopped, and his expression became a little serious. "Grandpa, what's wrong?" Noah suddenly became a little nervous. "There's a ghostly aura." A hint of red light suddenly lit up in Melander's white eyes. He flipped his hand, and a tortoise-shell stone appeared in his palm. Streaks of red light appeared on the tortoise-shell. In the end, only 2 streaks of red light were left, and they intersected to form a red. "It's in that direction." Melander's gaze moved away from the tortoise-shell stone, and he looked at the other end of the Eden Square. Those white eyes seemed to be able to transcend space. "Is it really a devil?" Noah's expression was a little nervous, but also a little excited. "It could be, or it could just be someone who's come into contact with a devil." Melander put away the tortoise-shell stone and continued forward. "Then should we do some preparation work? Like setting up a spell formation or something?" Noah quickly followed. "No need. That thing is so scary. Are we just going to face it head-on? I feel a little scared." Noah was a little hesitant. "Let's just take a look. There's no rush." "Grandpa, then what's the difference between you and the scumbag who just rubbed against me and didn't go in?" Noah rolled his eyes. "You always get carried away when you see something related to ghosts. If I encounter something I can't beat, I'll naturally calm down," Melander said calmly. Noah was actually speechless. However, he had seen how fierce his grandpa was with his own eyes. Although he was a little nervous, he wasn't scared off just like that. He continued to follow, but his footsteps were obviously a little slower. He was about half a step behind Melander. If there were any special circumstances, he could just hide behind him. Melander followed the tortoise-shell stone's guidance, and they arrived at the entrance of a restaurant located in the corner of Amy's. "Grandpa, is it the prison next door, or this one?" Noah looked at the rather luxurious restaurant in front of him, and then looked at the high walls of the Bataille prison not far away. This restaurant looked quite high-class, but it seemed to be closed after business hours. As for the Bataille prison next door, they had seen it from another entrance yesterday, and it didn't seem to be a problem. "It's here." Melander tapped the bamboo pole in his hand lightly on the ground, facing the entrance of the restaurant. "Then let me set up a spell formation." Noah jumped back and took out a string of tortoiseshell of various sizes. He raised his hand, and the tortoiseshell fell to the ground, forming a ring with him in the middle. "Go knock on the door." Melander tilted his head. "I just finished setting up this spell formation. Grandpa, why don't you go knock on it?" Noah was instantly terrified. "Any unnecessary movements will affect my ability. Knocking on the door is a small matter, so naturally, I can only leave it to you." Melander held the bamboo pole upright, and the tortoise-shell stone in his hand was already floating in the air. His white hair fluttered in the wind, and his expression was solemn. Noah gulped. This was the first time he had seen his grandpa so nervous. After hesitating for a while, he still walked out of the tortoiseshell circle and sneakily knocked on the door twice. Then he jumped back into the tortoiseshell circle with 2 big strides, and made a defensive posture. After a while, the door of the restaurant slowly opened, and a little half-elf girl walked out. Chapter 1977. Noah almost jumped up and used Almighty Dragon of Heaven. Oh no, it was Turtle Shellbind. But when he saw the little half-elf girl poking her head and half her body out, the turtle shell in his hands stopped in its tracks. The little girl was too young. She looked like she was only 3 or 4 years old, and she was too cute. Her silvery hair was let down, and her delicate and cute face had a little baby fat. Her blue eyes were as bright as sapphires, and she had a pair of translucent pointy ears. She looked like a little angel, tilting her head and looking at them with a puzzled expression. "Excuse me, is there anything I can help you with?" the little girl asked in a soft voice. Looking at a turtle? Noah responded quickly. He put down the turtle shell he had raised above his head and forced a smile. "But yours is a turtle shell?" Amy saw through him immediately. Although it's only a tortoise shell now, it was once a high-spirited tortoise. Back then, it was young and didn't know how to cherish it. It fell in love with a fish and risked its life for her. It was only when it lost its body that it regretted it and left behind this tortoise shell. Noah raised its chin slightly and said affectionately, "So, those turtle shells on the ground all have stories?" Amy took out a small stool from somewhere and sat down at the door. She rested her chin on her hands and looked at Noah with great interest. Behind her, 2 more little heads popped out and looked at Noah curiously. "My turtles?" Noah looked at the 3 little guys who were looking at him expectantly and felt a little awkward. It was easy for him to make up a story, but there were a total of 36 turtle shells on the ground. If he had to make up a story for each of them, was he even human? "Grandpa, these 3 little girls don't look like they have anything to do with that thing. Did you make a mistake?" Noah wanted to slip away, so he turned his head and asked softly. "Hey, kid, go and call your father out," Melander said to the pillar beside him. "Hey, Grandpa Blind, I'm over here," Amy said. She looked at Melander and said, "Do you need my father for something? He just finished his work and needs to rest now. You can tell me if there's anything." And stood in front of Jessica and looked at Melander warily. Melander's white eyes suddenly turned towards N, revealing a look of bewilderment. The tortoise-shell stone floating in front of him suddenly spun wildly. "Is there a guest?" At this moment, a gentle voice came from the restaurant. Meg walked out and stood in front of Anne. At the same time, he looked at the 2 people outside the door. The old man and the young man were dressed rather strangely. The old man's hair and beard were all white, and he wore a set of ragged clothes. His complexion was green, and his complexion was not too good. His eyes were green and white, with only the whites of his eyes visible. There was a thin bamboo pole in front of him, and on top of that bamboo pole was a rotating tortoise shell. The young man next to him was dressed rather normally. He wore a green short jacket and cotton pants, and carried a large bag on his back. However, his fluffy red hairstyle was too eye-catching, and people's attention would be focused on his hair. It had the effect of gaining the upper hand by a show of strength. However, under such a dazzling hairstyle, there was a rather young and obedient face. He looked to be in his early 20s. His skin was fair, his facial features were distinct, and he had a pair of clear brown eyes. If his hair was trimmed, he would be very attractive to young ladies and rich aunties. The restaurant's lunch hours have ended. "If you want to eat, please come back in the evening," Meg said with a smile. Noah looked at Meg nervously. He put down the tortoise shell in his hand and picked it up again. He glanced at Melander from the corner of his eyes, waiting for his signal. "We're not here to eat," Melander said, his white eyes staring at Meg. "All right. You guys go play in the amusement park on the 2nd floor. I've changed a new toy for you guys," Meg said to the 3 little guys with a smile. "Really? What new toy? Let's go." The 3 little guys ran into the restaurant happily. After the children left, Meg still had a smile on his face, but his voice became colder. "If you're not here to eat, turn right and walk forward. You'll find all kinds of fun things. Turn left and walk forward. The scenery is not bad. You're not simple. Melander had no intention of leaving. He was still staring at Meg. I should be the best chef in Chaos City now. Those who have eaten my dishes all think I'm not simple. Meg nodded matter-of-factly. You've seen things you shouldn't have, Melander said. Where did this old man come from? Meg's heart skipped a beat. He began to judge whether this was a scammer or a mysterious person with some skills. That little girl just now is not a normal person either. There shouldn't be any pure people in this world, Melander continued. Meg opened the door and said to the two of them, Come in for a cup of tea? If you have something to say it outside. We don't drink tea, Noah said nervously. He couldn't see through Meg's realm at all. Either he was a weak weakling, or he was a powerhouse countless times more powerful than him. All right. Melander kept the tortoise-shell stone and walked to the restaurant with the bamboo pole. Noah quickly tugged at the corner of his shirt and softly said, Grandpa, isn't this a little inappropriate? Melander patted his hand gently and gestured for him to calm down. Then he stepped into the restaurant. No demon cave, no demon spawn. I'm going all out. Noah kept the tortoise-shell stone formation and followed him into the restaurant. The restaurant's door closed slowly behind them. Noah looked back and swallowed his saliva. He held the tortoise-shell tightly in his hand and was prepared to use tortoise-shell bind on that fellow to make him lose his ability to resist. Just find a seat, Meg said casually, and went into the kitchen. Noah sat next to Melander, who was sitting by the window, and asked softly, Grandpa, it's him? The tortoise-shell stone is looking for him. Melander nodded. Then if we don't make a move now, when should we? Noah jumped up from the chair. The tortoise-shell had already spread out and formed a tortoise-shell stone formation under his feet. You're already an adult. Be more mature. Melander frowned. Don't set up a defensive formation so easily. You'll lose your momentum. Isn't this what you taught me? The one who survives to the end is the winner. Noah was not embarrassed at all. Meg came over with the brewed black tea and poured a cup for each of them. As soon as he put down the cup, he looked at Melander and asked, Who are you people? Chapter 1978. Once an expert opened his mouth, one would know whether he was right or not. Melander's first few sentences already gave Mag a rough idea of what was going on. This blind old man did have something up his sleeve. Although the old man didn't say anything, Meg knew very well that that thing had something to do with the great old one. Moreover, when they entered the door, the information that the omniscient door gave him made him interested. The old man's name was Melant. He was over 700 years old. He was a 10th-tier ghost with severe cataracts. The young one was called Noah. He was 20 years old. He was also a 7th-tier ghost. He could be considered a gifted existence among the younger generation. During this period of time, Mag had read many official and unofficial histories about the history of the Norland continent. He had seen some information about ghosts in one of the unofficial histories. They were a demonic race, but they had gone extinct during the war among species 500 years ago. From the limited information he had, they were an extremely mysterious race. And in that unofficial history, there was a mention of some strange behaviors of the ghosts. It was said that the powerful ghosts could control corpses to fight. There were even rumors that they were the devil's spokesperson in this world. Perhaps it was because of these reasons that the ghosts had always maintained a high level of mystery, but they still disappeared in history. However, looking at the grandfather and grandson in front of him, Meg had a rough idea in his heart. The ghosts might not have gone extinct, but they were living a very low-key life. As for why they came looking for him, and how they could tell that and was extraordinary, he was also curious. Melant looked at Meg and asked, Who are you? The owner of this restaurant. The person who will serve you. Meg leaned back in his chair. You've seen the devil, Melant said calmly. Noah held the turtle shell nervously and stared at Meg. Seems like you've seen it too. Meg leaned forward slightly and stared into Melant's greenish-white eyes. Melant was silent for a while. Suddenly, he broke into a smile. Seems like he couldn't persuade you. I'm a person who can withstand temptation. His tricks don't work on me. Meg also smiled. But how did you get rid of it? Maybe he didn't expect me to be blind, so his trick didn't work on me, Melanthe said. Noah was stunned. He didn't understand what they were talking about, but he could tell that his grandfather wasn't hostile to this guy, so he relaxed a little. Why you looking for me? Meg picked up the teacup and blew on it. You might not know this, but these things are actually sealed. But recently, half of them escaped. I want to find him and seal him again. The tortoiseshell stone led me to you. Melander looked at Meg. I think you should know where to find him. Melant pulled down his sleeve and looked at Meg and said, I know you're very strong, and I don't have the confidence to beat you. However, since you've seen him, you must have paid a price to break free. I hope that we can work together to find him and reseal him or kill him. I won't hurt that little girl, but I need a bit of her essence blood to expand the range of the tortoiseshell stone. I hope you can agree. Unexpected mission triggered. Request from Melant. As one of the few existences with the ability to find the Great Old Ones, Melant requests the host to establish a cooperative relationship with him. Set out to find the Great Old Ones who escaped the seal and reseal them. Mission reward, Chance of the Wheel of Fortune X3. The system's voice suddenly sounded in Meg's mind. Chapter 1979. We can work together, but I have 3 conditions, Meg said to Melant calmly. Tell me. Melant's greenish-white eyes seemed to sparkle. Firstly, after we work together, I will be the leader of all operations. You have to cooperate with me and not act on your own. Secondly, our cooperation is completely confidential, and no third party can know about this. I think this is what you want too. Thirdly, and can provide a drop of blood essence, but other than that, you can't ask for anything else. Otherwise, I will terminate the cooperation in my own way, Meg said calmly. Melant thought for a while and nodded seriously. I agreed to your conditions. Noah's mouth was slightly agape. He didn't expect Melant to agree to such harsh conditions. Happy cooperation. Meg raised his teacup. Happy cooperation. Melant and Noah raised their cups too, and finished it in one gulp. After confirming the cooperation, the atmosphere became much more relaxed. Noah kept his tortoise shell, and smilingly asked, Then, when are we going to catch the devil? Is that fellow really in Chaos City? Chaos City is only so big, and you only found me here. That means that fellow isn't here at all. Meg shook his head. Although the system's detection ability was not as good as a rock, if the Great Old One had appeared in Chaos City, it wouldn't be completely unresponsive. You know where he is? Melant asked Meg. I can only say that I'm guessing. Yesterday, when the Roth Empire launched a war against the orcs and elves, I found a corpse whose blood essence had been sucked dry at the scene in the Twilight Forest. I also found a ghostly aura with strong energy. I think this has something to do with the devil. Meg took out the photo stone and played the tragic scene in the Twilight Forest for Melant and Noah to see. This is the massacre after the war. Melant frowned slightly, but this could be a war caused by the devil. The Roth Empire's second prince, Josh, could have sold his soul to the devil. Then he took the opportunity when the king and the first prince were attending the peace conference in Chaos City to start the war, and ordered the massacre of all the tribes that were conquered. The image stopped at the corpse whose blood essence had been sucked dry. This is... Melant suddenly stood up and looked at that corpse in shock. You've seen it before? Meg asked. These are the corpses left behind by people who were controlled by demons to strengthen themselves. They absorbed the resentment and blood essence of corpses that had just died not long ago. 500 years ago, I met a demon who was controlled by demons. Back then, he massacred many small villages and left behind corpses like this. Melanthe nodded with a solemn expression. I didn't expect to see it again. Meg was deep in thought. This was basically in line with his deduction. He said, I'm not sure where to look for the escaped half of the demon, but Joshua might be a breakthrough direction. We have to find him first and capture or kill him to prevent him from growing and becoming the next demon. He's the devil's representative. Once he's strong enough, the devil will personally find him and take away his body. We need to find him as soon as possible. Melanthe nodded. We'll depart tonight. I'll bring you to the Twilight Forest. That's where he was last seen. Meg set a time. That little girl's blood essence, I'll give it to you tonight. All right, I won't disturb you any further. Melanthe nodded and left with Noah. Meg didn't get up to see his guest out. Instead, he poured himself another cup of tea. Uniting all forces to deal with the Great Old Ones was his current priority. The Norland continent's anti-Great Old Ones alliance had basically taken shape. However, the enemy was in the dark while they were out in the open. Everyone was at a loss, and they couldn't pinpoint the location of the demon. No matter how many people they had, it was useless. Melanthe's tortoiseshell stone was rather mysterious. It could detect the existence of the demon. He could even find who had been successfully purified. It was enough to show that he was quite skilled and had the demeanor of a reclusive expert. He had to find Joshua and kill him before he caused even more trouble. Amy poked her head out from the corner of the stairs and asked Meg, who was drinking tea alone, "Father, are those two guys bad guys?" "Not really." Meg shook his head with a smile and waved to the little one. Amy came to Meg and looked into his eyes. The sound of the flute moved. "If you're threatened, blink." "No one is threatening me." Meg smiled and patted the little one's head. It seemed like she was still worried about him when she went upstairs. He couldn't help but feel touched. "I'm super powerful now. If there are bad guys who want to hurt Father, you must tell me. I'll beat them up for you." Amy clenched her little fists. "I'm super fierce." My little tiger is super fierce." Meg nodded with a smile. However, the little one's fierce look was too cute. It didn't have any deterrence at all. It even made people want to pinch her little cheeks. Amy fell into Meg's arms and rubbed her little head against Meg's chest. "Then, shall we still have roast goose for dinner? Grandpa, can we trust that guy? Do we really have to listen to his orders?" Noah asked softly as he followed Melanthe out of Amy's. "I heard that a young human was very powerful recently. He killed many people. Benson, Weston, Bruno, and the others all fell under his sword." Melander's tone was filled with emotion. These were all powerful people from the same era as him. "You're saying that he's Alex?" Noah's eyes widened in shock. "A 30-year-old human can give me such a strong sense of pressure. Other than him, there shouldn't be another one." Melanthe nodded slightly. "But he's the #1 knight on the Norland continent. He's a dragon slayer warrior who can kill giant dragons in the sky. He's a terrifying existence who killed the king of the forest trolls. How did he become the owner of a restaurant and a stay-at-home dad with a child?" Noah was still in disbelief. They had been traveling around the Norland continent all these years, and he had heard many rumors. Alex's story was his favorite. Alex was a legend. He had already transcended species and became the legend of the entire Norland continent. A human, a sword, and a purple-striped griffin. He had killed all the powerhouses in the world, and even captured the heart of the beautiful elven princess. He had always been Noah's idol. However, such a super powerhouse had now become the owner of a restaurant and a stay-at-home dad with 3 children. Everyone has their own life and secrets. If you want to live longer, it's best not to try to find out other people's secrets, Melanthe said calmly. Noah had a bunch of questions that were at the tip of his tongue, but he swallowed them back down. He turned to look at Mamie Restaurant and thought to himself, I don't care about the secret, but I can build a good relationship with my idol. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. A catastrophe is coming. I wonder if she can bear the heavy responsibility of saving the world. Outside the city gate of Chaos City, the bishop in a white robe put down his hat and looked at the city gate tower in a daze. Sir, it's time to go, the people in the queue behind urged. Sorry. The bishop retracted his gaze and nodded slightly. He followed the crowd into Chaos City. Put the entire city on alert. Strengthen the checks before entering the city. All the outposts are under surveillance at all times. Guard against any possible invaders. Assemble a rapid response team. Get ready to reinforce the peace alliance at any time. The war may start at any time. You have to be 120% alert. Michael said to the City Lord's castle's officials in the meeting hall with a serious expression. Everyone left the meeting and went back to work. The peace conference was suddenly stopped, and the Roth Empire started a war. The City Lord's castle quickly became busy. City Lord, Lewis has already arrived at the meeting hall, Dicus said. I'll go over now. Michael picked up his teacup and finished the water in it. He stood up and walked out as he said, Is our inquiry document ready? Yes, it's ready. We rewrote it according to your suggestions yesterday. We're just about to show it to you. Dicus nodded. Wait a while. I'll meet Lewis first. Michael nodded and quickened his steps. After the war started, Michael almost didn't have any rest. He originally thought that the Roth Empire just wanted to increase their bargaining chip for the negotiation. However, from the results, this war had exceeded everyone's expectations. The Roth Empire's methods were even crueler than the racial war back then. They slaughtered dozens of orc tribes and almost took down the August tribe. They killed more than 50,000 innocent orcs. This was a huge blow to the orcs, and also an indelible hatred. Meanwhile, the elves' casualties were slightly better. The defense of the City of Life was very successful, and Irina's timely arrival prevented the situation from worsening. However, after being attacked by their most trusted neighbor, and almost having their core main city breached, and the Tree of Life almost destroyed, the elves probably couldn't trust their ally, the Roth Empire. All the races increased the level of war. The powerhouses stayed in their races to guard against any possible situations. There was no hope for the peace treaty to be renewed, and a new round of racial war could break out anytime. Now, all the races were in danger. Michael, the giant dragons have reached an agreement internally. If the Roth Empire doesn't give a satisfactory response to this matter, the giant dragons will send an expeditionary force to the Roth Empire, Lewis said directly as he looked at Michael, who walked in. Michael sat down opposite Lewis. After some thought, he nodded and said, Chaos City will respond to the giant dragon's decision in the name of the Peace Alliance. We will also send an elite team to attack the Roth Empire together with the giant dragons. All right, I will pass on your words. Lewis nodded and said, However, does Alex have any news about the devil? I haven't received any more news from him, but I believe he has been investigating this matter. Michael shook his head. All right. I still have to make a trip to the goblins and dwarves now. I hope you can pass on any news about the devil to us, the giant dragons, immediately, Lewis said as he stood up. All right. Michael also stood up to send him off. The roast goose became an instant hit, and became the favorite food of the gluttons because of its unique texture and wonderful taste that was irresistible. Meg wasn't surprised at all. Even he couldn't resist the temptation of the roast goose. After the dinner service ended, Meg bought a blood extraction and preservation device from the system, and drew a drop of blood from Anne's finger. The two children were a little tired after playing for the whole day. They fell asleep before Meg could finish his story. I know 2 people from the ghost tribe. They might be able to find Josh and the great old one who escaped from the seal. I am going to the Twilight Forest with them tonight, Meg said to Irina, who was leaning against the door frame after he walked out of the room. That old man looks a little strange. Are you sure he's all right? Irina looked out the window. Melander and Noah were already waiting under a tree in the park not far away. They found me with a piece of tortoiseshell stone and said that they sensed the aura of the great old one from me. I think he does have some ability. Meg nodded. This kind of human flesh detector was hard to come by. Compared to running around like a headless fly, it was obviously more efficient to use a radar with a coverage of 500 kilometers. Be careful, Irina reminded. Okay. Meg nodded slightly, turned around, and went downstairs. Here's what you want. Meg threw the small crystal bottle in his hand to Melander. Melander reached out and caught it. He raised the small crystal bottle to the moon, and a drop of pale golden blood shone like a gem. He is indeed a pure blood. Even his blood is so pure. Melander was a little dazed. Hello. After knowing Meg's identity, Noah's attitude was obviously much more humble. The way he looked at Meg also changed a little, with a little more admiration. Yes, hello. Meg nodded slightly. He had a good impression of this boy with a sham-8 hairstyle. After that, he said, "It's time to set off." "All right, let's set off now." Melander kept the small crystal bottle carefully. Not long after, a purple-striped griffin left Chaos City quietly and flew towards the Twilight Forest. "Should I call you Mr. Alex or Mr. Mac?" Noah asked nervously as he sat at the side and looked at Meg. "Up to you," Meg said casually. "Noah even specially came to the restaurant for dinner tonight." "Then I'll call you Mr. Mac. It feels more intimate that way." Noah grinned and sat closer to Meg. It was as if their relationship had really become much closer after changing the way he addressed him. "My name is Noah." "Huh. Nothing. Och. This nickname is fine too. You can call me whatever you want." Noah chuckled. His bootlicker nature was fully displayed. Meg agreed and was about to close his eyes to rest for a while. "I didn't expect you to be an excellent chef at the same time as a powerful knight. You must be very hardworking, right?" Noah asked as he looked at him expectantly. "No, this is just my talent. It has nothing to do with hard work. Just like how you can't beat me no matter how hard you work," Meg said calmly. Ugh. Chapter 1980. Noah choked a little. He looked at Meg in silence for a while and tried to ease the awkwardness. "Mr. Mac, it's nice to meet you." "How nice?" Meg looked at him and asked seriously. "I'm very happy." Noah was about to cry. "Then it's too early for you to be happy. Usually, people who work with me are very tired," Meg said calmly. "I'm not afraid of being tired. I just like working with you. It gives me face." Noah chuckled. He would be proud to tell others about it in the future. "But I'm afraid I'll be a burden." Meg looked at him. Noah was speechless. All right, there was nothing to talk about. It was the first time Noah felt a blow from a big boss. It hurt him a lot. "Although my grandson is useless, he can still be a bait," Melanti, who had been silent all this time, said. Noah widened his eyes and looked at Melanti in disbelief. Was this the reason why Grandpa brought him along? "That's it. Demons usually don't like him." Meg shook his head. "That's true. He's too ordinary." Melanti nodded. Noah slowly sat at the back and hugged his knees, feeling depressed. The purple-striped griffin flew very fast. In less than 3 hours, they could see the Twilight Forest from afar. Melanti had also dripped En's blood into the tortoiseshell stone during the journey. The red lines on the tortoiseshell stone turned golden. The closer they got to the Twilight Forest, the more golden spots shone on the tortoiseshell stone. It was like a starry sky. He did appear here, and he didn't stay in one place. Melanti looked at the tortoiseshell stone floating and spinning in front of him with a serious expression. "Let's go to the nearest marked spot." Meg glanced at the tortoiseshell stone and rode the purple-striped griffin downwards. The golden spots got closer and closer, and the ruins of a tribe gradually appeared in everyone's sight. The once prosperous middle-sized tribe had been burned to the ground. The scene should have been cleaned up by the orcs of other tribes. In the middle of the tribe, there was a tall mound with a blackened stone pillar. The top of the stone pillar was carved with a cheetah, which should be the tribe's totem. After confirming that there was no one around, the purple-striped griffin landed on the ground. He stopped here not too long ago. Judging from the devil chi, he shouldn't be the devil's true form. However, this guy who sold his soul has fallen deeply into the demonic path. After absorbing a lot of blood essence and resentment, his strength has skyrocketed. He will be more and more difficult to deal with. Melanti walked around the ruins and finally stood in front of the mound in the center. He said with a solemn expression, "How strong?" Meg asked with a frown. Initially, Joshua was only a mage who had yet to reach the 7th tier. While he could not be said to be completely powerless, he was not a threat at all. However, after single-handedly causing this war and massacre, His strength had skyrocketed by absorbing resentment and blood essence. That was not a good thing. Melanthe sat cross-legged and formed a seal with his hands. He took out a golden red talisman from somewhere and held it between two of his fingers. He muttered something and pointed at the mound in front of him. The golden red talisman burst into flames and floated toward the mound, then merged with it. The ground suddenly began to shake, and the mound that was pressed tightly together also began to sway. The soil rustled and fell. Is the corpse coming to life? Meg subconsciously took 2 steps back. The night was cold, and so many orcs had just died here. Seeing the mound of graves trembling, as if something was about to crawl out of the ground, it was a little creepy. Mr. Mac, don't be nervous. My grandfather is communicating with them, Noah said with a smile. He did not expect Alex to be afraid of ghosts too. Ghosts can communicate? Meg frowned. Yes, we are ghosts. Isn't it normal for us to communicate with ghosts? Noah nodded. Look, we don't look like ghosts. Meg was deep in thought. It seemed that he had to look up more information about ghosts when he went back. He knew too little about them. The ground suddenly stopped shaking, and a broken face appeared on the stone pillar. It used a strange tone to communicate with Melanthe, but it quickly dissipated. Melanthe sighed and slowly stood up. He said in a low voice, the bodies were burned, and the souls were stolen and devoured. Only a few remnant souls managed to escape, so there was not much information. That guy was wearing a black robe, and his strength was above level 9. He might have reached level 10. If there are enough remnant souls and resentment, you can get more information, right? Meg asked. Yes, the bodies can talk because the souls will not disappear immediately. The resentment can exist for a long time. The more complete the soul, the more information can be obtained. Melanthe nodded. Then I'll take you to a place. Meg jumped back onto the griffin's back and left with Melanthe and Noah. Soon, the griffin landed in a ruin 100 miles away. Just like the previous tribe, this place had been cleaned up. The tall tombstones looked very lonely, and the occasional crow's cry added to the chill. This was the tribe that Meg came to yesterday. The resentment here is quite strong. It was not completely devoured, Melanthe said in surprise as soon as they landed. I came here yesterday. He must have sensed my presence, so he left in a hurry. He did not have time to completely absorb the resentment, Meg said. I see. Then it's easy. Melanthe nodded. He did not waste any more time. He sat down in front of the tombstones and began to cast the spell again. Meg's heart skipped a beat when he saw the green resentment emerging from the tombstones. He looked at Melante's back and couldn't help but think of the Taoist priest who vanquished demons. This ghost tribe was a little different from what he had imagined. They were not named because their abilities were similar to ghosts, or because they looked strange. Instead, they were named because they could communicate with ghosts. About 10 minutes later, Melander, who had said something to the group of ghosts, recited an obscure incantation. The lingering aura of resentment gradually dissipated, and the surroundings returned to normal. They said the one who devoured the resentment was a terrifying young man. They couldn't see his face clearly, but he had a terrifying aura. He was at the 9th tier, and had yet to reach the 10th tier. He appeared not long after the tribe was massacred. However, he left in a hurry for some reason, Melanthe said to Meg as he stood up. Meg nodded slightly, and said, looks like we can basically confirm that it was Josh who did it. Chaos City is currently investigating the Ministry of War. He should have initiated this war without Andre's permission just to absorb the resentment of these innocent people who were slaughtered. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.